He built an empire on silence and blood, and the one thing he never saw coming walked barefoot out of the ocean. If you've ever loved someone so completely that losing them hollowed out everything you thought you were, stay until the last word. This story will break you open. Drop a like and leave your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels before it's done. The town didn't have a name worth remembering. That was why Vincent Moretti had chosen it. It sat wedged between a limestone cliff and a stretch of gray Atlantic coastline that nobody photographed and nobody missed. 300 residents who minded their own business. A fish market that opened at 5 in the morning and closed when the catch ran out. A bar with no sign above the door where the bartender poured without asking and forgot your face the moment you stepped back into the salt air. It was the kind of place that existed in the margins of the world. The kind of place that didn't make it onto maps that mattered, and that was exactly the point. Vincent had been here 11 days. He had not made a single phone call. He had not opened his laptop. The encrypted satellite phone that Gio, his head of security, had pressed into his hands at the airstrip sat inside the kitchen drawer beneath a folded dish towel, and Vincent had not touched it once. He ate simply. Eggs in the morning, whatever the fish market had left by afternoon, a glass of bourbon at night while he sat on the narrow rear deck and listened to the water move against the base of the cliff. He slept more hours than he had in 15 years. He did not dream, which was itself a gift he had not expected. The thing about winning a war was that nobody told you what came after. For 6 years, Vincent had been fighting, not one conflict, but a cascading sequence of them, each one folding into the next the moment it was resolved, a hydra that grew new heads every time he thought he'd buried the last one. The Calabrese network in the northeast, the Petrov faction pushing product through the ports, the Valdez cartel trying to buy political cover inside his own distribution channels. He had dismantled them one at a time with the methodical patience of a man who understood that the only difference between winning and losing was who ran out of options first. He had run no one out of options faster than everyone who had ever moved against him. 3 weeks ago, the last credible threat had been neutralized in a boathouse outside Providence. He hadn't pulled the trigger himself. He hadn't needed to. He had simply sat at a table across from a man who had spent 2 years trying to kill him and explained very quietly exactly how thoroughly Vincent had destroyed every lever of power the man had ever held. The conversation had lasted 9 minutes. The man had not said a word after the 4th minute. He had simply looked at Vincent with the hollow expression of someone who finally understood the shape of the trap they'd walked into years before they'd ever noticed the walls. Vincent had driven to the airstrip an hour later. He had not said goodbye to anyone. The morning of the 12th day, he woke at 6 without an alarm and stood in the kitchen in bare feet while the coffee brewed and watched the fog sit low over the water. It was the color of old pewter, that fog, and it moved the way thick things move, slowly, without urgency, indifferent to anything beneath it. He poured his coffee black and went out onto the deck and leaned against the railing and let the cold air press against his face. And for the first time in a memory he couldn't place, nothing was required of him. No decision, no calculation, no assessment of threat or loyalty or exposure, just the fog and the water and the sound of his own breathing. He had forgotten what that felt like. He was still standing there an hour later when the fog began to lift, peeling back from the shoreline in slow strips until the beach below the cliff was visible. A narrow crescent of dark sand and rounded stones that curved for roughly a quarter mile before disappearing around the headland. At this hour, it was empty except for the birds picking along the waterline and 1 or 2 figures moving in the middle distance, indistinct enough to be strangers. He watched without interest. Then one of the figures moved in a way that stopped his breathing. It was the walk. He had known in his life exactly one person who walked that way, weight slightly back on the heel, each step placed with a deliberateness that looked effortless but wasn't, the shoulders carrying a particular kind of quiet that wasn't serenity but rather the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to keep their interior life invisible. He had spent 3 years sleeping next to that walk, watching it cross hotel lobbies and courtrooms and the long marble corridors of the house they'd shared before everything fell apart, and he had not forgotten a single degree of it. His coffee cup touched the railing and stayed there. The woman was barefoot, her shoes held loosely in one hand, the other hand occupied in a way it took him another moment to process, because it was not empty. She was holding the hand of a child, small, maybe 5 or 6, dark-haired, stumbling happily over the larger stones at the waterline. And there was a second child, slightly older, ranging ahead and doubling back the way children do when the world is still large enough to be entirely interesting. A bright sound floating up to the cliff that took him a moment to identify, because it had been so long since he'd heard it directed at anything connected to him. Laughter. The child was laughing. Elena was laughing too. Even at this distance, with the morning light still thin and oblique and the remnants of the fog softening everything, he knew her face. He knew the angle of it when she turned toward the water. He knew the way she tilted her head back when she laughed, and how her free hand came up instinctively, almost touching her own collarbone, a gesture he had watched her make 10,000 times without ever studying it, and which now struck him with the force of a physical blow. He gripped the railing. The older child sprinted back toward Elena and grabbed her arm and pointed at something in the water, and Elena bent down and looked, and the younger child pressed in close to see, and for a moment all three of them were crouched at the edge of the tide, heads together, examining whatever small miracle the ocean had deposited on their stretch of sand. Vincent could not move. His mind was doing what it had always done under conditions of extreme disruption, running inventory, pulling facts, trying to construct a map of what he was actually looking at. Elena Cross. He had last seen her 4 years ago across a conference table in an attorney's office in Manhattan, both of them signing documents that ended their marriage with the cold efficiency of a business dissolution. She had not looked at him, not once. She had signed every page her attorney indicated, gathered her copies, and walked out without a word, and the door had closed behind her with a sound that was not loud, but that he had heard in the space behind his sternum every day since. She had no children, that was a fact. They had tried, twice, early in the marriage, and both times ended in a grief so private and so crushing that they had stopped speaking about it entirely, each of them carrying the weight alone, until the weight became another wall between them, and eventually the walls were all there was. He had accepted it. He had buried it in the same interior space where he buried everything that had no tactical utility. He had moved forward. But those children. The older one turned its face toward the cliff for just a moment, chasing the flight of a gull. And even at this distance, even with the light doing what it was doing, Vincent saw it. The jaw. The line of the brow. The way the child held its shoulders, unconsciously, without any model to copy from. He had looked at that face in mirrors his entire life. His hand left the railing. He did not know he was moving until he was already through the door, already pulling on his jacket, already moving through the house toward the front, and then down the exterior stairs that switchbacked down the cliff face toward the beach path, his body operating ahead of any conscious instruction he could have given it, driven by something that was not thought and not instinct, but some third thing that lived below both. By the time he reached the sand, they were gone. He stood at the base of the cliff path and looked in both directions along the empty beach and felt the cold air move through him and understood, with a clarity that was almost physical in its precision, that his 11 days of silence were finished. He found the house by late afternoon. It wasn't difficult. The town was small and Elena had never been a woman who went unnoticed, not because she tried to attract attention, but because she had a quality of presence that registered even in peripheral vision, something in the way she occupied space that people remembered without knowing they'd cataloged it. The woman at the fish market had seen her 3 times this week. The man who ran the small grocery 2 blocks off the waterfront knew her by the items she bought. Whole milk, 2 kinds of pasta, the brand of olive oil they only stocked because she'd asked once if they could order it. He hadn't known her name. He'd known she rented the blue house at the end of Moore Street, the one with the painted shutters and the garden that the previous tenant had let go to weeds. Vincent drove past it twice without stopping. It was a good house for disappearing. Set back from the road behind a line of overgrown hedges, small enough that you wouldn't look twice. The kind of property that communicated nothing about the person inside it. The shutters were, as the grocer had said, blue. A particular shade of blue that was almost gray, weathered by salt air to the point where it looked less chosen than inherited. A child's bicycle was propped against the side of the house, plastic toys visible in the scraggly garden. 2 sets of small rubber boots near the back door, one slightly larger than the other. He parked a block away and sat in the car for 40 minutes. What he was doing, he told himself, was constructing his approach. What he was actually doing was giving himself time to stop shaking. His hands had been steadier under gunfire than they were right now on the steering wheel of a borrowed sedan in a town that nobody remembered, watching the windows of a house where a woman he had spent 4 years trying not to think about was living a life that appeared, from what he could see, to contain children who shared his bloodline. He forced himself to think through it systematically. Option 1. He had imagined it. The distance, the light, the angle, the disorienting effect of 11 days of enforced stillness on a mind built for perpetual vigilance, any or all of those factors could have produced a pattern where there wasn't one. He had looked at the child's face for no more than 3 seconds. That was not a reliable basis for the conclusion he'd drawn. He held that option for approximately 4 seconds before discarding it. Option 2. The children were not his. Elena had moved on, as people do, as she had every right to do, and by some geological accident of circumstance, she had moved on with a man whose physical genetics overlapped sufficiently with Vincent's that from the top of a sea cliff in poor morning light, the resemblance had seemed significant. This was the more rational possibility. This was what a man with his experience and his history and his fundamental understanding of how the world actually worked should have concluded. He could not make himself believe it. Option 3 was not a comfortable place to sit. Option 3 meant that Elena had been pregnant when she walked out of that attorney's office, that she had been carrying children, twins, or close enough in age to look like twins, who were his, that she had known and said nothing, that she had disappeared into exactly this kind of marginal geography with exactly this kind of studied invisibility and raised them alone, without him, for 4 years that he had spent on the other end of the earth fighting battles that apparently had nothing to do with the most significant thing that had ever happened in his life. His jaw was tight enough to ache. He drove back to his rented house on the cliff and sat at the kitchen table for an hour and did not touch the bourbon. Then he opened the drawer and took out the encrypted satellite phone and sent a single message to a number that only 6 people in the world possessed. The reply came in 11 minutes. He read it once, set the phone on the table face down, and looked at the wall. Then he started working. The man Vincent had contacted was named Felix Rourke, which was not his real name, and he worked in the architecture of information the way other men worked in concrete, patiently, invisibly, leaving structures that looked like they'd always been there. Vincent had used him 4 times in the past decade. He charged more than anyone else in his field and delivered more than anyone else in his field, and he had a quality Vincent valued above nearly everything else. He did not speculate. He found things, or he didn't, and if he found them, he reported exactly what he'd found with no embellishment and no interpretation. Vincent supplied his own interpretation. What Felix found over the next 36 hours was sufficient to make the wall that Vincent had been staring at feel very far away. Elena Cross, born Elena Marin, adopted name Cross from her foster family, later Cross Moretti for 3 years, and then Cross again, had lived in this town for 3 years and 4 months. She had arrived under a name that was not hers from a residential address in coastal Maine that she had occupied for approximately 8 months prior, which put her departure from their shared life at a distance of roughly 3 months after the divorce was finalized. She had not been alone when she arrived. The children were registered in their birth records as Mia and Lucas Cross. Mia was 4 years and 7 months old. Lucas was 4 years and 5 months, 2 months apart, which meant they were not twins but had been born to the same mother in rapid succession. Irish twins, the old phrase went, though the phrase was imprecise and the fact behind it was simple. Elena had been pregnant twice in the 18 months before Vincent had last seen her, and he had known about neither. The birth father field on both certificates was blank. Felix had also, because Felix was thorough, pulled the medical records from the private obstetric clinic in Portland that Elena had used for both pregnancies. He had attached them without comment. Vincent had read the dates 3 times before setting the phone down. Mia had been conceived approximately 6 weeks before the divorce proceedings began. Lucas had been conceived approximately 3 weeks after they started. He sat with that for a long time. The timeline was not ambiguous. He had been the only man in Elena's life during that period, not because he had monitored her, but because he had known her, had understood the architecture of her days, and her loyalties and her particular brand of self-possession that made casual intimacy with anyone else not merely unlikely, but essentially impossible for a woman of her specific nature. He knew what he knew. These were his children, and she had not told him. The anger came up fast and hard, the way anger always had for Vincent. Not hot, but cold, which was worse, which had always been worse. A kind of crystalline fury that organized itself around a fixed point and did not dissipate, but simply compressed, becoming denser and more precise the longer it held. He let it come. He did not try to redirect it because he had learned years ago that redirecting it without processing it meant it showed up later in worse places at worse times. He sat with it until it was finished doing what it needed to do. Then he set it aside and thought about why. That was the question Felix's information didn't answer. It told him what and when with the precision he'd paid for, but the why was not a matter of records and dates and addresses. The why was Elena, and Elena had never been a woman who did things without reason. She was not impulsive. She was not careless. She had survived a childhood that would have broken most people without developing a capacity for clear-eyed decision-making that had been one of the first things he'd ever respected about her, back when respect was still a word that applied to whatever had been happening between them. She did not do things without cause. She had hidden his children from him for 4 years. There was a reason for that. He did not know yet what it was, but he was going to find out. He watched the house for 2 days without approaching it. He ate almost nothing. He slept in 4-hour increments, waking each time with the particular alertness of someone whose nervous system had been trained for years to treat darkness as a threat environment. He watched from a distance with a pair of field glasses he'd bought at the hardware store on the south end of town, and he cataloged what he saw with the systematic precision that had kept him alive in situations where less precise men had not survived. Elena's routine was consistent. She was up by 6:30. He could see the kitchen light before the sun cleared the headland. She made breakfast, he could infer, from the movement visible through the kitchen window and from the way the children materialized in the kitchen space at around 7. Mia, the younger one, always first. Lucas came down slower, still pulling on a shirt or a sweater, the way boys do when mornings are irrelevant to their agenda. They ate together at a table Vincent couldn't fully see. By 8, the children were outside in the garden. By 9, Elena was at the small desk he could see through the window of what appeared to be a home office, working on something he couldn't identify at this distance. She was not living in fear. That was the first thing he'd looked for, the signs of a woman in hiding, a woman under threat, a woman watching her exits. He knew what that looked like. He had operated in proximity to it his entire adult life. Elena showed none of it. Her posture when she moved through the garden with the children was open. She let Lucas range ahead without scanning the perimeter behind him. When a vehicle came down Moore Street, she didn't look up. She slept with the bedroom window cracked even on the colder nights. He could see the curtain moving. She felt safe here, which meant either she had not been running from anything, or she believed that whatever she'd been running from was no longer looking. On the afternoon of the second day, he made a decision. He was done watching. He left the field glasses on the passenger seat and drove to the end of Moore Street and parked the car in the same position he'd used twice before, far enough to be unremarkable, close enough to reach the front gate in 30 seconds, and sat for exactly 3 minutes. Then he got out of the car, put his hands in his jacket pockets, and walked to the front gate of the blue house. The gate was unlocked. The garden path was flagstone, uneven, the kind that shifted slightly under your feet if you stepped near the edges. He noticed this the way he noticed everything. Not because it was relevant, but because his mind did not know how to stop noticing. The front door had a painted knocker that was starting to rust at the hinge, and 2 small handprints in paint on the door frame that someone had made at a height that suggested the children had been very young when they made them, and nobody had seen any reason to paint over them since. He raised his hand to knock. The door opened before he touched it. Elena stood in the doorway, and the expression on her face was not surprise. It was the expression of a woman who has been waiting for something terrible for so long that when it finally arrives, what she feels is not panic, but the particular grim relief of a thing that is finally finished with the waiting. She looked exactly like herself, which was what destroyed him. 4 years and she was exactly herself. The dark hair shorter now, cut close at the sides and longer on top in a way that suited her. A few more lines at the corners of her eyes that she had earned, dressed in the ordinary clothes of a woman who had spent the morning in a garden and hadn't changed yet. She was beautiful in the way she had always been beautiful, which was quietly, without apparatus, the kind of beauty that announced nothing and withdrew nothing. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I wondered when you'd stop watching from the car." He said nothing. "How long?" she asked. 2 days? She absorbed that. Her hand was still on the door frame, and he watched her grip tighten slightly on the painted wood, the only tell she allowed herself. "The children are at my neighbor's for the afternoon," she said. It was not a casual detail. It was a deliberate piece of information, placed precisely, and what it meant was, we can talk without them hearing. "Elena," he said, "don't." Her voice was level. "Just don't start with my name like that. I know what you're going to say and I know what you want, and I'm asking you to come inside and sit down before we do any of this, because I've been standing here holding this since before those children were born, and I'd like to not have it on my feet." He stepped inside. The interior of the house was the interior of a life. That was the only way to describe it. Not decorated, but inhabited. The way spaces get when people actually live in them, rather than performing living in them. Children's books stacked sideways on the lowest shelf because that was the only shelf they could reach. A drawing taped to the refrigerator that appeared to be a dog, though the dog had 6 legs and wings, and underneath it, in Elena's handwriting, a notation, "Lucas, age 4. A basket of small shoes near the door. A smell that was coffee and something baked, and the particular background warmth of a house that had been occupied happily for a long time. Vincent stood in the middle of it and felt the cold fury from 2 nights ago try to reassemble itself, and found that in this room, surrounded by this evidence, it couldn't quite get traction. Elena put a kettle on without asking and stood at the counter with her back to him for a moment before she turned around. "Ask," she said. "Are they mine?" It wasn't a question. They both knew it wasn't a question. Elena looked at him steadily. "Yes." The word landed in the room and stayed there. He had known. He had known from the cliff in the gray morning light, had known in the cellular way that bypasses analysis entirely. But hearing it spoken in her voice, flat and unhedged, removed the last theoretical possibility that he had been wrong. And the removal of that possibility did something to the space behind his sternum that he did not have vocabulary for. "Why?" he said. She crossed her arms. Not defensive, cold. There was a difference, and with Elena there always had been a difference. "Because I was told that if I didn't disappear, you were going to have me killed." The silence that followed was of a quality he had not experienced before. He had been in rooms where men were dying. He had sat in silences that meant wars were starting or ending. He had experienced the particular silence of a space after someone has said the worst true thing in it. But this silence was different from all of those because it contained something he did not have a framework for, which was the possibility that the 4 worst years of his life had been constructed by someone else's hands. "Who told you that?" he said. Her jaw tightened. "Damien." The name hit him the way names sometimes do, not loudly, but with a kind of subterranean concussion, the way an underground explosion moves through soil before it breaks the surface. Damien Voss. His consigliere. The man who had been at his right hand for 11 years. The man he had trusted with everything short of his own life, and on several occasions with that as well. "He came to me," Elena said, 6 weeks after we filed. "I was already pregnant with Mia. I hadn't told you yet because things were bad between us, and I was trying to—" She stopped. Reset. "He came to my apartment. He said you'd found out about the pregnancy." "I hadn't found out," Vincent said. His voice was very quiet. "I didn't know." "I know that now." Her eyes didn't waver. "He said you'd decided the babies were a liability, that a man in your position couldn't afford, those were his words, couldn't afford, the complication of children and a public custody situation. He said you'd given orders." Vincent stood very still. "He showed me documentation," Elena continued, and her voice was doing something now. It was staying flat by effort. He could hear the effort, the way you can hear the frame of a structure taking load. "Communications, your signature, instructions to—" She stopped again, pressed her lips together. "He gave me a number, a contact who could relocate me. He told me if I took it and disappeared, you'd have no reason to send anyone after me. He told me if I stayed, you'd move within the week. You believed it, Vincent said. I believed it. She said it without flinching, but there was something behind it, something that had lived behind it for 4 years, and he recognized the weight of it because he had carried different weight of the same species. You were who you were, Vincent. I had seen what you were capable of. I had watched you make decisions that... She shook her head once, sharply, cutting herself off. I had 2 living things inside me and a man I thought I knew telling me the alternative was having them end before they started. I took the number. I got on a bus. I never looked back. The kettle was screaming. Neither of them moved toward it. Damien, Vincent said, just the name, again. Damien, she said. He turned away from her and put both hands flat on the kitchen table and looked at the surface of it. The wood was old and the finish was worn through in places from years of use by people he didn't know, and the grain ran in a particular direction that his eyes followed without any instruction from him. He was aware of his own heartbeat in a way he almost never was. He was aware of his hands and the pressure he was applying and the faint creak of the table taking it. 11 years. 11 years of Damien Voss at his right hand, in his confidence, in every room where decisions were made. 11 years of counsel and loyalty that Vincent had considered so reliable, he'd stopped questioning it the way you stopped questioning the floor. You just walked on it because the floor had never given way. The floor had given way. Not all at once. That was the nature of a long betrayal. It didn't announce itself. It just accumulated quietly in the gaps between what you trusted and what was actually happening, until the accumulated weight of all those gaps became something that could end a marriage and disappear a woman and erase 2 children from a man's life as completely as if they'd never existed. He straightened up, turned back to Elena. She was watching him with an expression that was not soft and was not hard, but was something in between that he recognized as the specific look she wore when she was trying to read him, without letting him see that she was reading him. She had always been better at that than she knew. He had always been able to tell. Tell me everything he said to you, Vincent said. Exact words, as close as you remember them. Every meeting, every piece of documentation, everything. She looked at him for a long moment. This isn't over yet, is it? She said. It wasn't a question either. No, he said. It's not. Something moved through her face, not fear, but the recognition of what was coming. The same recognition he'd seen in men who understood they were standing at the beginning of something very large and very dark, and that the only direction was through. She pulled out a chair and sat down, and she started talking. They were still at the table 3 hours later when the neighbor brought the children home. Vincent heard the gate open, and Elena's posture shifted, not dramatically, just a calibration, the way a person's body adjusts when something precious has entered the perimeter. She stood up and went to the door and stepped outside, and he could hear her voice through the open window, easy and warm in a way it hadn't been in the kitchen, the voice she used with the children that was a different register entirely from every other mode he'd known her to have. He stayed at the table. He heard the children's voices, Mia's higher and faster, Lucas's lower and more considered even at 4 years old, and the combination of the 2 of them talking at once over each other while Elena responded to both simultaneously with the unconscious fluency of a woman who had been doing this alone for a very long time without anyone to hand it off to. Without him. The door opened and they came in ahead of her. Lucas first, almost stopped dead when he saw a stranger at his kitchen table. The older child's instinct for threat assessment kicking in before he'd consciously registered what he was looking at. Mia came around him and stopped too. Less wary, more curious, tilting her head in a way that did something to Vincent's chest he was not equipped to manage in the middle of a kitchen. "This is a friend of mine," Elena said from behind them. Her voice was exactly level. She was extraordinary. "His name is Vincent. He's going to have dinner with us." Lucas looked at him with eyes that were dark and watchful and entirely, unnervingly familiar. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Do you know how to play cards?" Vincent said, "Yes." Lucas said, "Good," and walked past him toward the living room as if the matter were settled, and Mia followed her brother with the implicit faith of a younger sibling who trusts the older one's reads on the world, and Elena came to stand beside Vincent and lowered her voice until it was only for him. "You can't do anything that brings danger to this house," she said. It was not a request. I don't care what you have to do out there. I don't care what it costs you. Nothing touches them. If you can promise me that, you can stay for dinner. If you can't, you need to leave right now, and I need to know it's the last time you're going to stand in this doorway. He looked at her. I can promise it, he said. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Then she moved toward the refrigerator and said, without turning around, Then get in there and let him teach you his card game. He made up most of the rules and he cheats, so pay attention. Vincent walked into the living room where his son was already shuffling a deck with the focused intensity of a child who took invented games very seriously, and he sat down on the floor across from him, and Mia pressed in beside him immediately, the way small children press in beside anyone who will allow it. And for the next hour and 40 minutes, he sat in a house by the ocean and played a card game with rules that changed every 3 hands, and he lost badly and repeatedly, and it was the most undone he had felt in his adult life. He did not show any of it. He never did. But when Elena called them to dinner and Lucas stood up and walked toward the kitchen, and Mia reached up without thinking and put her small hand into Vincent's to pull him to his feet, he felt the pressure of those 4 fingers against his palm and understood, with a completeness that no amount of rational analysis had given him, exactly what Damien Voss had taken from him, and exactly what it was going to cost. He did not go back to the Cliff House that night. He drove instead to the north end of the town, where the road ran close enough to the water that you could hear the waves against the rocks below the shoulder, and he pulled off onto the gravel verge and sat with the engine off and the window down and the cold air coming in off the ocean, and he called Felix Rourke. "Everything you have on Damien Voss," he said when Felix picked up. "From the last 5 years, financial movements, communications intercepts, internal organizational alignment. Who he's been talking to inside the family structure that wasn't going through me. I want it in 48 hours. Felix said, "That's going to require some 48 hours, Vincent said. A pause. "Understood." He ended the call and sat for another hour in the dark with the ocean moving below him. Damien had been at every meeting during the divorce. He had been the one who recommended the attorneys, who advised on the terms, who sat beside Vincent throughout the process and offered counsel that Vincent had accepted without skepticism because Damien had never given him reason for skepticism. Not once. Not in 11 years. That was the architecture of it. He was beginning to understand. The long patience of it. You didn't build a deception like this in weeks or months. You built it over years, constructing credibility until credibility was so total that the truth could sit right beside you and you would not recognize it because everything you'd been given told you it was something else. The question was why? Damien had power. He had money. He had access to everything short of the title itself, and the title had never seemed to be something he wanted. He had refused it once, explicitly, when Vincent had tested him with it, and his refusal had seemed genuine. It had been one of the reasons Vincent had trusted him. But there was a difference between not wanting the title and wanting Vincent neutralized. A man with a wife, children, something worth protecting, something that anchored him to a life outside the organization, that gave him a gravity that no amount of internal loyalty could fully replicate. A man like that was harder to control. He made different calculations. He had different threshold for what he was willing to sacrifice, which meant he had different limits on what he could be convinced to order. A man with nothing but the empire was the empire. Vincent had been the empire for 4 years. He understood now what Damien had built. He also understood that this understanding had arrived at approximately the same time that his encrypted phone had come back to life after 11 days of silence, and that anyone monitoring that network, anyone in a position to know his habits and his security protocols, would have noted the activity and drawn conclusions. He pulled the phone out and checked the settings. Then he sat very still for a moment. Then he said quietly to no one, "You've been watching for me to surface." He drove back toward the Cliff House, using a route he hadn't used before, and he watched his mirrors the entire way. And when he pulled into the drive, he sat in the car for 4 minutes before going inside. And in those 4 minutes, he began constructing what the next 72 hours were going to look like, with the methodical deliberateness of a man who has been here before, who knows what the edge of the cliff looks like, and who has always been willing to step off it when the alternative was something worse. From the kitchen drawer, he retrieved the encrypted phone. He composed a message. 7 words. Sent it to the same 6 people who had the number. Then he went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and waited for the world to start moving again, which it did. 12 minutes later, when his phone vibrated with the first of 3 replies that told him what he'd suspected. Damien Voss already knew he was here, and he wasn't waiting. The 3 replies were brief. That was how Vincent's people communicated under protocol. Brevity as discipline, no detail that didn't need to be there. The first was from Gio, his head of security, and it said, "Movement on D's end, 2 teams, northeast grid." The second was from a woman named Carla, who ran his intelligence infrastructure out of a server facility in Maryland, and it said, "Financial transfers. Offshore. Last 72 hours. Big." The third was from a man Vincent knew only as Strand, who had no formal role in the organization, but who existed in its peripheral nervous system the way certain nodes exist in a network. Not central, not visible, but load-bearing in ways you only understood when they failed. Strand's message was 4 words. "He knows you're alive." Vincent read them in sequence twice. Then he put the phone on the table and drank his coffee and thought about the order of things. By morning, he had made 4 calls, issued 9 instructions, and booked a rental property 12 minutes inland from the coast under a name that did not belong to him. He did not move to it immediately. He drove past it at 7:15 while the light was still low, assessed the sight lines and the access points and the nearest road that could carry weight, and then he drove back toward the water and parked at the top of the cliff path and watched the beach below for 20 minutes without seeing anything that concerned him. Then he drove to Moore Street. Elena answered the door in the same kind of clothes as the day before. Practical, unremarkable. The clothes of someone whose mornings were about other people rather than herself. She looked at him and read his face in the half-second before he'd said anything, and her expression tightened in a specific way. Not fear, but the recognition of incoming difficulty. "How bad?" she said. "Come outside," he said. She pulled the door mostly closed behind her, leaving it cracked so she could hear the children inside. They stood on the front path in the thin morning light, and he told her in plain language what the 3 messages had contained and what they meant. He did not soften any of it. He had learned years ago that softening information for Elena was not a courtesy she wanted. She had told him once, directly, that what frightened her was not the truth, but the space where the truth should have been and wasn't. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "How long do we have?" she said. "I don't know. If he's running 2 teams in the northeast grid, they may already be triangulating from my last known position. I surfaced the phone 3 nights ago. That was the mistake." "You knew it was a mistake when you made it." "Yes." She looked at him. "You did it anyway because you needed to know about Damien." "Yes." She exhaled through her nose. It wasn't a sigh. It was the specific controlled breath of someone managing a response they don't have time for. "So you put my children at risk to confirm something you already believed." He did not flinch from it. "Yes, and I'm going to do everything in my capacity to correct that. But I need you to listen to me right now and not later." Her jaw was set. She was furious, and she was managing it with the precision of someone who understood that fury had a time and this wasn't it. He respected it, even as he felt the weight of having caused it. "The children need to move," he said. "Not you, not yet. They need to go somewhere Damien has no map to, somewhere off every grid he has access to, which means off every grid I've ever had access to, because anything I know, he knows." "You're asking me to send them away." "I'm telling you it's the only play that keeps them safe while I deal with this." "Deal with it." Her voice was very flat. "You mean kill him?" "I mean remove the threat. Don't dress it up for me." She stepped back half a pace, not in retreat but in the way people step back when they need more air. "Don't stand on my front path and dress it up. I've been married to you. I know what remove the threat means." "Then you know it's what this requires." She looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was doing something to her face that he did not permit himself to analyze. "There's a woman," she said finally. "Her name is Ruth. She taught at the school where I worked in Maine before I came here. She's the only person on earth who knew where I went when I left there, and she kept that for 3 years without anyone asking her, so she can keep this too. Her place is in Vermont. No connection to you, no connection to anyone in your world, no digital trail that leads anywhere near either of us. When can you reach her? Now, I can call her now. Do it, he said. She went inside. He stood on the path and listened to the town waking up around him. A car starting somewhere on the next block, a gull making noise over the fish market, the distant sound of a boat engine turning over in the harbor. Ordinary sounds, the sounds of a place that did not know what was moving toward it. She came back out in 7 minutes. Ruth will take them. She can have them for as long as we need. She stopped. The word we had arrived in her own sentence unexpectedly. He could see her register it, and she didn't walk it back. I'm driving them myself. That exposes you. I'm not putting my children in a car without me to take them to a place they've never been. I'll come back the same day. She held up a hand before he could respond. That's not negotiable, Vincent. That one's mine. He looked at her. Take the inland route. Nothing with tolls. Stop once, pay cash. Don't use your phone after you leave this driveway until you're back inside this house. I know how to disappear, she said. I've been doing it longer than you have. They were gone by 9:30. He watched from the end of the street as Elena's car turned off Moore Street and headed north through the back road that curved inland past the quarry. Mia had waved at him from the rear window. He didn't know why. He was a stranger she'd met once, but she'd waved anyway with the uncomplicated instinct of a 4-year-old, and Lucas had not looked back at all, staring ahead through the windshield with an expression of determined seriousness that was so familiar it was almost unbearable. Vincent went back to the Cliff House and started making calls. The first was to Gio. He asked for the current location of both teams Damien had mobilized and was told they were operating out of a logistics hub in Providence, which meant they were 4 hours out by ground, less by air. He asked about the hub's security configuration and got what he needed. He told Gio to flag anyone inside the organization who had been in direct communication with Damien outside of normal reporting structures in the past 6 months, and to do it quietly, in a way that didn't signal the inquiry. Gio said he'd need 24 hours. Vincent said he had 12. The second call was to Carla. She walked him through the financial movement she'd flagged. 3 transfers, substantial, through a chain of shell entities that terminated in an account structure she hadn't seen before. She'd traced the architecture back far enough to identify a pattern she recognized from past work on organizational corruption cases. It was a liquidation structure. Someone was converting hard assets to portable wealth at a pace that suggested they were planning to move and move soon. He's planning to run, Carla said. After he closes this, Vincent said. That would be my read. How long does he have before the structure collapses, before the shells become traceable? 6 weeks, maybe 8. So he's working to a timeline. Has been for a while, she said. Some of these transfers initiated 8 months ago. He's been building toward this for at least a year. Vincent sat with that for a moment. A year. While he was running the Northeast campaign against the Petrov faction, while he was managing the Valdez Channel negotiations, while he was spending 18-hour days on the operational details of dismantling the last 3 threats to the organization, Damien had been building a parallel architecture beside him, present at every meeting, nodding at every decision, carrying every piece of strategic intelligence that Vincent had produced and redirecting it quietly into the framework of his own exit. Send me everything you have, Vincent said. Every date, every transfer, every entity in the chain. Already in your queue. He ended the call and opened the documents she'd pushed through and spent the next 2 hours reading them with the focused attention of a man who had learned long ago that the distance between a mistake and a catastrophe was almost always a detail that someone had decided wasn't worth examining closely. He examined everything closely. He always had. The irony of it, that his thoroughness in every domain had not protected him from the longest and most consequential deception of his life, was not lost on him, but he set it aside because there was no version of this where self-recrimination was useful. What the document showed was a man who had been extraordinarily careful for a very long time and had made, in the last 90 days, 2 errors that careful men make when they are close to the end of something and their patience has begun to fray. The first error was speed. The transfers had accelerated in the past month beyond what the shell structure could absorb cleanly, leaving traces that Carla had found because she was exceptional at her work. The second error was redundancy. Damien had used the same intermediary entity twice in different transfer chains, which should never happen if the structure was built correctly, which meant either his builder had been sloppy or Damien had been in too much of a hurry to catch it. Both errors suggested a man who was running out of patience. A man running out of patience made decisions in compressed time frames, which meant Vincent's resurfacing hadn't just been noted. It had likely triggered something Damien had been holding in reserve, waiting for the right moment. And Vincent had inadvertently handed him the moment by going quiet for 11 days and then lighting up his communications network in a location that was apparently less anonymous than he'd believed. He closed the documents and stared at the wall. Then he sent a message to Strand. 4 words, mirroring the 4 words he'd received. Where is he now? The reply took 6 minutes. Yacht, Harrow Point, since yesterday. Vincent knew the yacht. He had been aboard it twice. Once at a celebration he now understood in a different light entirely. Once for a meeting whose decisions he was now reassessing with cold, methodical fury. The Harrow Point anchorage was 30 miles down the coast, accessible by water or by the single coast road that wound down through the cliff communities south of here. Accessible, and also removed from the teams in Providence. Damien had put himself on the water, away from the teams, away from the organizational structure, behind a security perimeter that belonged to him personally rather than to the family infrastructure. He was isolated by choice. Vincent thought about that for a long time. Felix Work's file arrived at 2 in the afternoon and Vincent read it straight through without stopping. It was not the longest document Felix had ever produced for him. It was the most damaging. 11 years reconstructed in clean, unsentimental chronology, not the version Vincent had experienced, but the version running beneath it, the shadow architecture that Damien had built and maintained and refined across more than a decade of proximity to power. It started earlier than Vincent had expected. Not 4 years ago, not with Elena. It started 8 years back, when the organization was in a period of genuine vulnerability following the death of Vincent's predecessor, and the question of succession had been answered in Vincent's favor only after a period of internal contest that had been more dangerous than Vincent had fully appreciated at the time. Felix had found communications, encrypted but not encrypted against the quality of effort Felix applied, in which Damien had positioned himself in the succession contest not as Vincent's advocate, but as a moderating force, presenting himself to multiple parties as a man who could work with whoever emerged, collecting leverage in every direction while appearing to commit in one. Vincent had won. Damien had adjusted. He was very good at adjusting. The section on Elena was 16 pages, and Vincent read all of it twice. The fabricated documentation, the communications bearing Vincent's supposed signature, the operational orders Damien had shown Elena to convince her to run. Felix had traced the production chain to a document fabricator in Baltimore who had worked for Damien on at least 4 other projects. Felix had located the man, established his identity, and included his current address as a footnote. The fabricator was still alive. He was still working. He was, in other words, a witness. Damien had used third parties for the fabrication rather than handling it internally, which was smart from a compartmentalization standpoint, but created an exposure that a man with more time might have closed by now. The fabricator presumably didn't know what the documents had been used for. He didn't need to. He just needed to confirm that he'd produced them, and for whom. Felix had also found the contact Damien had given Elena, the relocation facilitator. He had found the facilitator and the facilitator's records and Elena's intake documentation, all of it. The chain of custody on Elena's disappearance was complete, attributable, and entirely inconsistent with any version of events in which Vincent Moretti had ordered his wife and children removed. Felix's file did not include conclusions. He never included conclusions. He didn't need to. The conclusions were obvious. Vincent had everything he needed to walk into a room of family captains and lay it out and watch Damien's authority dissolve in real time. He had documentary evidence, a live witness, financial records that demonstrated premeditated asset liquidation, and the testimony of a woman who had been told, by name, that Vincent wanted her dead. He had the case. He had it completely. The problem was the 48 hours or less that separated him from the moment Damien's teams arrived on the coast. He drove inland to the backup property at 4 in the afternoon and let himself in and sat at the kitchen table and thought. He was still sitting there when his phone rang at 5:17 with a number he recognized as Gio's secondary line, which Gio used only when he believed his primary was compromised. "Talk," Vincent said. "One of the teams broke from Providence." Gio's voice was controlled, the way it got when he was reporting something he didn't want to report. 2 hours ago. They're not running the Northeast grid anymore. They're running coastal. Vincent's hand tightened on the phone. How many? 4 men in the first vehicle. We haven't confirmed a second. Did you pull the family alignment I asked for? Yeah. A pause. Vince, it's not good. Tell me. 3 of the 6 captains have been in side communication with Damien in the last 4 months. Not 2, not 1. 3. Messina, Carver, and Old Brew, no. Another pause. Bruno especially. The volume on Bruno's side is, it's not advisory communication. It looks organizational. Vincent was quiet for a moment. Messina and Carver he could work around. They were opportunists. They'd positioned near Damien because Damien had seemed like the rising side, and if that calculation changed, they would recalculate. But Bruno had been in the family for 30 years. He was not an opportunist. If Bruno had made a choice, he had made it with his eyes open, and that meant the conversion effort was not 3 captains, it was potentially deeper. The other 3, Vincent said. Solid, Gio said. Specifically Reyes and Park. I'd put my life on them. You may have to. He thought for a moment. Put Reyes and Park on notice. I need them reachable within the hour. Use the clean protocol. Done. What else? The team that broke from Providence. Can you track them? We have 1 vehicle on visual. Lost the second about 40 minutes ago on the interchange. Lost it how? Driver switch. They know we're watching the plates. Vincent stared at the kitchen wall of the inland house. 2 teams. 1 visible, 1 dark. 4 hours ago, they'd been in Providence. If the visible vehicle was running coastal, the dark vehicle could be anywhere in a 40-mile radius. Could be parked 2 streets over from Morse Street right now. Elena wasn't back yet. He checked the time. She'd left at 9:30 with a 4-hour drive to Vermont and a 4-hour return. She should have been back by 6 at the latest, which was 40 minutes away, which was acceptable. She'd been on the road for almost 8 hours. If she'd stopped once, paid cash, kept to the inland route, his phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't have stored. He opened it. It was a photograph. The photograph showed a parked car. He recognized the car. It was Elena's. It was parked outside a gas station on a road he didn't immediately identify, and the timestamp on the image was 45 minutes ago. Beneath the photograph, a message. Brought back early. Couldn't leave them with a stranger. He called the number. It rang twice, and Elena picked up. Where are you? He said. 40 minutes out. Her voice was steady, but there was something behind it. I got there. I talked to Ruth, and then I couldn't leave them. Mia was crying and Lucas was holding it together, but he was white. Vincent, he was... She stopped. I tried. I sat in the car at the end of Ruth's driveway for 20 minutes, and I could not make myself drive away. He closed his eyes for 1 second. 1 second only. Listen to me, he said. There is a team somewhere in the coastal corridor and I don't have its position. You need to come directly to the inland property. I'm going to text you the address. No stops, no detours, and if you see any vehicle that stays behind you for more than 3 consecutive turns, you call me immediately. The children are going to be with me and with you in a secured location within the hour if you drive the way I'm asking you to drive. He kept his voice entirely level. It cost him something to keep it level. Can you do that? A breath. Yes. Text me when you're 20 minutes out. He ended the call and sent the address, and then he stood up from the table and went through the inland property with the focused attention of a man preparing a position, identifying the sight lines from each window, the structural choke points, the exit options, the distance to the nearest road that could support a vehicle in a hurry. He moved fast and he moved systematically, and he did not permit himself to think about the photograph of Elena's car parked at a gas station on a coastal road, while somewhere in the same corridor, a four-man team was running dark without a position he could confirm. He was in the back room checking the rear exit when his phone rang again. Geo. Primary line. "We found the second vehicle," Geo said. Something in his tone stopped Vincent cold. "Where?" Vincent said. "Morse Street," Geo said. "They're parked on Morse Street." He was already moving before the call ended. The inland property had a rear door that opened onto a gravel track running parallel to the coast road, and Vincent went through it at a pace that was not quite running but was everything short of it, phone pressed to his ear, Geo still talking. "How long have they been there?" Vincent said. "We clocked them 14 minutes ago. They haven't moved." "Are they on the house or on the street?" "Street. Parked facing south, which puts them with a sight line to the front gate. They're waiting for someone to arrive." They're waiting for Elena, Vincent thought. She'd sent him that text from a gas station 45 minutes ago. If Damien's people had been monitoring the same communication channels Felix had accessed, and if Damien had resources inside the network infrastructure that Vincent hadn't yet identified, they could have the number, could have the location ping from that text, could know she was inbound. "Pull them off," he said. "Vince, if I move on them now, I know what it signals. Pull them off anyway. 2 men. Quietly, Geo. Nothing that puts the street on alert." A brief silence. "Give me 8 minutes." "You have 5. He got into the car and drove. Not toward Morse Street, toward the coastal road that Elena would be coming in on, the approach from the north that she'd have taken from the inland highway junction. He drove fast without being reckless, which was a distinction he'd learned 20 years ago and never forgotten, because reckless was how you ended up unable to finish the thing you'd started. His phone buzzed. "Elena, 20 minutes out as instructed." He pulled to the shoulder and called her back immediately. "Change of route," he said when she picked up. "Are you on the coast road yet?" "Just turned onto it. Why?" "Turn around, go back to the highway junction and take the 9A south until you see a gas station with a blue awning. You'll pass it in about 4 miles. Pull in and wait. Don't use your phone except to call me. I'll come to you." A pause. She was reading the gravity in his voice the way she always had, not the words, but the register. "How bad?" "Manageable. But I need you off the coast road right now." He heard the car slow, the signal tick, the sound of a turn. "Done," she said. "Vincent, the children are asking questions. Tell them we're going somewhere new tonight. Tell them it's an adventure." He paused. "It won't be a lie. Tell them the truth of it later." He heard her breathe, then, 4 miles south? Blue awning. I'll be there." He ended the call and pulled back onto the road and drove south. Geo called back in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. "Done," he said. "Both men pulled. We used the utility cover. Gas leak reported. Street access restricted. They won't know it was a move." "Did either of them make contact before you reached them?" "One of them had his phone out. We couldn't confirm whether he'd sent anything." Vincent said nothing for a moment. One man with a phone out, status unknown. It was the kind of variable that could mean nothing or could mean that somewhere on the Harrow Point anchorage, a man on a luxury yacht had just received a notification that things were moving faster than planned. "Track the first vehicle," Vincent said. "The one you had visual on. Where is it now?" "Still running coastal, heading south. At current pace, they'll reach the town in about 22 minutes. South, the same direction Elena was now traveling. "How far behind her are they?" he said. Hard to say without knowing her exact. "Guess," a pause. 12 minutes, maybe 15. He pressed the accelerator down. "Keep them on visual. Do not lose them again." He found the gas station with the blue awning in 3.5 minutes. It sat at a slight bend in the road where the land flattened before the next headland, the kind of small commercial outpost that existed to serve the people who forgot to fill up before leaving town. Elena's car was already there, pulled around to the side of the building away from the road, and she was standing outside it with her arms wrapped around herself against the cold, and both children pressed against her like something seeking warmth. He pulled in beside her and got out. Lucas looked at him with those watchful eyes, the same read-the-room stillness he'd had at the card table, only sharper now because the room was different, and children are acutely sensitive to the difference between adults who are in control of a situation and adults who are managing one. Mia had her face against Elena's side and was not crying but was in the physical posture of someone preparing for it. Vincent crouched down to their level. He had not planned what to say. He didn't have a register for this, for talking to children in the middle of an emergency without transferring the emergency into them. He looked at Lucas, and Lucas looked back at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then Vincent said, "You're good at cards." Lucas blinked. "You lost on purpose?" "Once. The other times you just beat me." The boy's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, the small, involuntary response of a child who is frightened and has just been handed an ordinary thing to hold. "Where are we going?" Lucas said. "Somewhere safe," Vincent said. "A place I know. You'll have your own room." He looked at Mia, who had turned her face to look at him with eyes that were wet at the edges. "Both of you." Mia said, "Will Mama be there?" "The whole time," Vincent said. He stood up and looked at Elena, and she gave him a look that was complicated in several directions at once. Gratitude and resentment and exhaustion and something else that he didn't examine closely because there wasn't time. He took her keys and moved her car to the far end of the lot behind the building where it wasn't visible from the road, then transferred them all to his vehicle. They were back on the road in 4 minutes. He drove south and then cut inland on a secondary road that wasn't on any navigation app because it was a county maintenance track that had been paved over years ago and then forgotten. He'd found it the first morning he'd spent exploring the geography around the town, because he always found the roads that weren't on maps. It was a reflex, the same one that had kept him operational in places where the official infrastructure was not something he could trust. His phone buzzed from the center console. Geo. He answered it on speaker. "Talk." The southern vehicle just passed the gas station turnoff. Vincent checked the mirror. Empty road behind him. "They didn't pull in?" "Went straight past. They're continuing south." Not tracking Elena then. Or not anymore. If the one man with the phone out had sent a location ping and then lost the signal when she changed routes. He exhaled fractionally. "Let them run," he said. "I want to know where they stop." The property he'd booked inland was a converted farmhouse that a rental company managed for an owner who spent 8 months a year in Portugal. It sat at the end of a half-mile private drive surrounded by second-growth woodland, the kind of land that had been cleared for farming 50 years ago and then let go when the economics stopped working. There were no neighboring properties visible from any window. The drive had 2 points where it narrowed enough to function as natural choke points, and the main structure had a cellar with a ground-level egress that Vincent had found in the first 10 minutes of his walkthrough that morning. He got the children inside, and Elena moved immediately into the domestic mode that he'd watched her inhabit at Moore Street. Efficient, calm at the surface, communicating safety through the ordinary actions of opening cabinets and running water and finding where things were. Within 20 minutes, she had located the kitchen well enough to produce something warm for the children to eat, and within 40 minutes, both of them were in the larger bedroom upstairs, Mia asleep and Lucas not far behind, his determined seriousness finally losing the argument with exhaustion. Elena came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Vincent across the length of the room. "Tell me everything now," she said. "All of it," he told her. He went through Felix's file, not the paperwork itself, but the substance of it, the fabricator, the relocation facilitator, the 8-year timeline, the financial structure that Damien had been building for the past year. He told her about the 3 captains. He told her about Bruno, which was the piece that cost him the most to say aloud, because Bruno had been a fixture of Vincent's entire tenure, and the conversion of a man that embedded meant the rot was not peripheral, but structural. Elena listened standing up. She didn't sit down, didn't make tea, didn't do any of the things people sometimes do in these conversations to give themselves somewhere to put their hands. She stood in the doorway with her arms at her sides and listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "He spent 11 years beside you." "Yes, and you never—" She stopped herself. He watched her make the decision not to complete that sentence. It was a mercy he didn't deserve, and she offered it anyway. "What do you need?" I need to get to the yacht before he decides the teams haven't delivered and changes his position. He checked the time. I have a window, maybe 6 hours. And the captains? The 3 who are with him? Reyes and Park are solid. They can hold the other 3 in a non-hostile equilibrium for long enough if I reach Damien first. Without Damien, the conversion falls apart. He's the architecture, not them. They don't have the leverage or the plan without him. She was quiet for a moment. And what happens to him? He looked at her directly. He goes away. She absorbed that with the same expression she'd worn when she'd corrected him about dressing things up on her front path. She didn't correct him again. She understood the language and she understood what she was hearing, and she made no move to argue about it. Come back, she said. It was not a request and not a sentiment. It was a condition. Yes, he said. He left the farmhouse at 9:40 with Gio on the phone coordinating from a position 3 miles up the coast road, and he drove south toward Harrow Point with the window down and the cold ocean air moving through the car. He had a weapon. He'd had it since the Cliff House, a compact piece he'd carried more or less continuously for 15 years, and 2 additional magazines in the jacket pocket. And he had his phone and Felix's documentation encrypted on a device he could wipe in 4 seconds. He had Strand's last known confirmation that Damien was still aboard the yacht. He was 40 minutes from Harrow Point when his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go. Something made him answer. The voice on the other end was one he knew. Vincent, said Damien Voss. The sound of that voice after everything Felix's file had laid out was a physical thing. It moved through him like cold water, not shocking because he hadn't expected to hear it, but because hearing it made the abstract concrete in a way that documentation hadn't. This was the voice that had sat beside him for 11 years, that had counseled patience when he wanted to move fast, and speed when he wanted to deliberate, and had calibrated both in directions that had served Damien's architecture rather than Vincent's judgment, and Vincent had not seen it, had trusted it, had built decisions on it the way you build on ground you've never tested. He kept his own voice level. Damien. You've been busy, Damien said. There was no affect in his voice, no guilt, no bluster, no performance. He sounded like a man concluding a business call. Felix Rourke. He's thorough. I've always said that about him. Vincent said nothing. I'm assuming you've spoken to Elena, Damien continued. And I'm assuming you've pulled the financials and you've had Gio do the alignment check, and you have some version of the full picture by now. A pause. I want to have a conversation. We're having one. In person. Aboard the vessel. Come to Harrow Point and we talk. You have my word that nothing moves against Elena or the children while we're talking. Your word, Vincent said. I know what that's worth to you right now. I'm offering it anyway because it's what I have. Another pause. Vincent, I'm not running. I could have run 3 days ago when I knew you'd surfaced. I'm still here. That should tell you something. Vincent kept his eyes on the road and turned this over. A man who is running does not call you and invite you to his location. A man who is running goes, and Damien was right that staying communicated something, but what it communicated was not necessarily what Damien wanted it to communicate. It could mean he was confident. It could mean he had something Vincent hadn't accounted for. What is it you want to tell me? Vincent said. Not on the phone. A brief silence. Come to the yacht. 2 hours. Come alone. He ended the call without committing to anything and drove another mile in silence, and then called Gio. Damien just called me, he said. What? Invited me to the yacht, in person, 2 hours. He paused. He's not running, Gio. Gio was quiet for a moment. That could mean he doesn't need to run. Yes, Vincent said. That's the part that concerns me. Come on. He arrived at Harrow Point at 11:15. The anchorage was a natural indent in the cliff coastline, deep enough for serious vessels sheltered from the prevailing weather by a rock formation to the northwest. There were 3 boats moored here tonight. Damien's was the largest, a 60-foot motor yacht that sat low and dark in the water, lit along the rail with the understated lighting of something expensive, a tender at the stern dock. Vincent sat in the car at the top of the access path for 6 minutes. Then he got out and walked down. The man at the tender was someone he didn't recognize. Hired security, not family, who checked him for weapons with a professionalism that suggested prior military and then stood aside without a word. Vincent stepped into the tender and was taken across the 50 yards of dark water to the yacht's boarding platform. Damien was waiting in the main saloon. He looked, Vincent thought, exactly like himself. That was the first and most disorienting thing. 11 years of a face, and he had expected the face to be different now that he understood what lived behind it, expected some visible evidence of the architecture, some residue of the deception. There was none. Damien Voss at 61 was what he had always been, lean, controlled, silver-haired, dressed with the understated precision of a man who had long ago resolved the question of who he was and found no reason to keep reconsidering it. He gestured to the seating area. "Sit down." Vincent did not sit. He stood in the center of the saloon and looked at Damien and let the silence do what silence does. Damien sat instead, which was fine, which Vincent had expected. He poured 2 glasses of something amber from the bottle on the table and pushed one toward Vincent's side and did not touch his own. "I'm not going to apologize," Damien said. "You didn't come here for that, and it would be an insult to both of us." "Why, Elena?" Vincent said. Damien looked up at him. It was the first time the control had shown even minor friction, just a shift in the eyes, a brief recalibration. "That's where you want to start." "Why, Elena?" Vincent said again. Damien leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had rehearsed this, or who had lived inside it long enough that rehearsal wasn't necessary. "Because you were going to destroy everything you'd built," he said. "Not her fault, not intentional, but a man in your position with a pregnant wife and a custody situation, and a woman who knew enough to level 3 federal investigations, that's not a liability you manage. That's a catastrophe you prevent. So you decided to prevent it for me. I decided to prevent it instead of you because you wouldn't have." Damien's voice carried no heat. It was the voice of a man presenting a position he considered self-evident. "You were in love with her. I'd watched it make you stupid for 2 years. Not weak, you were never weak, but stupid in the specific way that men get stupid when they've decided someone is the exception to every rule they've ever lived by." He paused. "She was going to get you killed, or imprisoned, or both. I removed the vector. My children," Vincent said, "were collateral to the decision. I told her what I told her to make her move. I didn't intend—" He stopped, the friction in the eyes again, slightly more visible this time. "The children were not a target. They were never a target. You showed her paperwork saying I'd ordered her death. Yes. You fabricated an order from me to kill my own wife and children." Damien was quiet for a moment, to make her run fast enough that she wouldn't hesitate. "A woman who is afraid for herself might wait. A woman who is afraid for children doesn't wait. She moves." He met Vincent's eyes. She moved. She lived. The children lived. The outcome I intended was preserved. The cold in Vincent's chest had been there since Morse Street, since Elena's name for it. It had been getting colder since the farmhouse kitchen. Now it reached a temperature that was below anything he'd experienced in all the years of his life in this world. And it was not the cold of anger. The anger had burned itself down to something harder and more permanent than anger. It was the cold of understanding something completely. "You've been running me," he said, "the whole tenure, every decision." Damien tilted his head very slightly, not a denial. "The Calabrese campaign, the Petrov Channel, the Valdez negotiation. Those were mine." "The strategy was yours," Damien said. "The intelligence you made them on was curated." Vincent looked at him. "Curated. You were excellent at war, Vincent. You're the best tactician I've ever worked beside. But you needed the right information to aim at, and the right information was not always the complete information. A king who fights every battle exhausts himself and his kingdom. A king who fights the right battles wins the battles I chose for him," Vincent said. The silence in the saloon was very complete. Somewhere beneath them, the water moved against the hull with a low, patient sound. Damien looked at Vincent with an expression that was not triumphant and was not remorseful and was something else entirely. The expression of a man who has been waiting a very long time to be seen accurately and is experiencing the ambiguous relief of it. "The three captains," Vincent said, "are mine, yes, have been for 2 years. Bruno." "Bruno came to me," Damien said. "He didn't like the direction. The Northeast campaign cost the family in ways you didn't fully account for. The Petrov takedown created enemies in channels you didn't know existed because I hadn't shown them to you. Bruno is a man who tallies costs, and Messina and Carver. Follow whoever appears to be winning. You know that better than I do." Vincent stood in the center of the saloon and did the arithmetic. 3 captains. Both field teams. The organizational infrastructure that Damien had been building in the negative space of Vincent's tenure for how long? 8 years from the first communications Felix had found. 8 years of parallel construction. "Why now?" Vincent said. "The timeline you've built. The financial structure is 6 weeks from collapse. You could have held another 6 months. Damien's jaw moved. Barely. But it moved. Certain situations have accelerated. What situations? A pause that lasted long enough to be a decision. The Petrov remnants are not as dismantled as you were told. There are elements I couldn't control that have been operating independently for the past 8 months in the channels you don't know about. They approached me." He looked at Vincent steadily. "They wanted the organization intact, under new leadership, as a going concern. The alternative they presented was a different kind of takeover, the kind that doesn't leave anyone in the current structure in a position to object afterward." Vincent felt the floor of the saloon shift slightly as the yacht moved on its mooring. He felt it because he was paying attention to the physical environment in the way he always did, the unconscious continuous inventory of a man who had learned that the environment was always telling you something. The Petrov remnants, not dismantled, operating in the channels he didn't know about because Damien hadn't shown them to him. "You made a deal," Vincent said. "I made an arrangement," Damien said carefully. "The distinction matters." "It doesn't." Vincent looked at him. "You traded the family to the Petrov network in exchange for your exit. I traded a leadership transition for a managed outcome that keeps—" "You sold us," Vincent said. The 2 words sat in the saloon and didn't move. Damien looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "The Petrov representatives arrive tomorrow morning. By noon, the transition document needs to bear your signature or mine. I was hoping, genuinely, that it would bear yours. A voluntary abdication, your people would accept it, the captains who are still yours would stand down, and the family survives intact under new structural ownership. The alternative," he paused, "is not a conversation I wanted to have with you." The alternative was Vincent's death. He understood that without needing it spoken. "You called me here," Vincent said slowly, "to ask me to sign over the family to the Petrov network. To offer you a choice. Your signature, your exit, your life. And Elena and the children remain untouchable. That's the offer. That's what I can give you." He leaned forward slightly. "Vincent, I am not your enemy. I have never been your—" "Don't," Vincent said. Damien stopped. "Don't say that to me on this boat tonight." His voice was very quiet and very level, and Damien had known him long enough to understand what that quality of quiet meant, because Damien was watching him with the first real wariness Vincent had seen from him in the entire conversation. "You fabricated the death of my wife. You erased my children from my life for 4 years. You curated the intelligence I made every decision on for 11 years, and you used my own organization as collateral for an exit deal with people I spent 3 years dismantling because they were a threat to everything I'd built." He stopped. "And you called me to this boat to tell me the terms." "The terms," Damien said, and his voice was controlled, but the control was effortful now, "are the only terms available. The Petrov representatives are not—" "Where are they?" Vincent said. Damien blinked. "What?" "The Petrov representatives. They arrive tomorrow morning." "Where?" The wariness shifted into something sharper. "That's not information I'm—" "Damien." Vincent stepped forward once, closing the distance between them by 3 feet. enough to change the geometry of the room. You have spent 11 years learning how I read situations. You know what I'm doing right now. You know I'm not going to sign anything, and you know why I asked you where they are." He stopped. "So tell me, where?" A long silence. Outside the hole, the water moved. From somewhere forward on the vessel, a sound, a footstep, then another, then a third, coming toward the saloon. Not the hired security from the boarding platform. 3 different footsteps, 3 different weights. Damien looked at Vincent, and something moved through his face. Not guilt, not apology, but the complex expression of a man who has played a long game and has reached the move he least wanted to make. "I'm sorry," Damien said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, he sounded like he meant something. "I genuinely am." The saloon door opened and 3 men came in who were not Damien's regular security, whose bearing and equipment and the way they positioned themselves in the room said very clearly what they were and who had sent them. And Vincent understood in that moment that he had walked into the yacht without a secondary exit plan because he'd believed he was walking into a conversation, and instead he had walked into the closing of a trap that Damien had been setting for 11 years. And the difference between the man he'd been for those 11 years and the man who needed to survive the next 11 minutes was the difference between a king who fought the right battles and a man with nothing left to lose who had 2 children asleep in a farmhouse 40 minutes up the coast. He took stock of the room in the half-second he had. 3 men. The one nearest the door had his hand already moving toward his weapon, which meant he was the most dangerous and the first problem. The second was positioned to cut off the portside passage, which meant the intended resolution was not a clean exit, but a contained one. The third was covering Damien, which told Vincent something important. Damien had not fully trusted even this arrangement, had not been certain that the Petrov representatives would hold to the terms they'd offered him, and had positioned their man between himself and the door as much to keep himself in play as to keep Vincent in. Nobody in this room was completely safe. Vincent picked up the untouched glass of bourbon from the table in front of him and looked at Damien across the rim of it and said, with a steadiness that surprised even himself, "You should have run when you had the chance." Then he threw the glass at the light fixture above the nearest man's head and moved into the dark before it finished falling. The glass hit the fixture and the saloon dropped into near darkness, and Vincent was already moving. He went left, not toward the door, not toward Damien, but toward the port side passage that the second man was covering, because the second man was covering it to prevent exit. And a man focused on preventing exit is a man whose attention is split between the threat in front of him and the door behind him, and split attention is the only opening Vincent needed. He covered the distance in 2 steps. The second man had his weapon up, but hadn't fired because in the dark he couldn't confirm his target wasn't Damien, and that half-second of fire discipline was the half-second that cost him. Vincent hit him low, below the weapon arm, driving his shoulder into the man's ribs with the full transferred weight of someone who had learned that in close quarters the body is always faster than the thought. And they went into the passage wall together with a sound that was dense and final, and the weapon clattered somewhere on the floor of the passage, and the man made a sound that meant he was not getting up quickly. Behind him in the saloon, he heard the first man moving and Damien's voice saying something sharp and commanding in a language that was not English. And then a shot. Not aimed, a reaction shot, the kind fired by a man whose eyes hadn't adjusted and who was operating on sound, that punched through the partition wall of the passage 6 inches above Vincent's left shoulder. He kept moving. The passage ran forward toward the bow and he went through it fast, hand on the wall for orientation, the yacht's motion registering in his feet. A slight roll, maybe 2 degrees. The anchorage was protected but not flat. He found a door by touch and went through it into what turned out to be a forward cabin, dimly lit from the porthole by the anchorage lights outside. He had 4 seconds before they organized. He used them. Assessed the cabin. A berth, a fixed table bolted to the hull, 2 portholes too small for exit, a second door on the far side that would run aft along the starboard passage, parallel to the port passage he'd come through, which meant if they split to cover both approaches, he was contained. He needed to change the geometry. He went to the porthole and looked out. 6 feet of freeboard between the hull and the waterline, The dark water moving below, the dock lights at Harrow Point visible 200 yards across the anchorage. The porthole was too small. He looked at the berth, at the fixed table, at the door. Then he looked at the ceiling. The forward hatch was right there, a flush deck hatch, the kind that opened onto the bow deck, with a recessed handle that turned a quarter rotation to unlock. He reached up and turned it and pushed, and the hatch swung open and cold ocean air came down through it like a fist, and he went up through it in one motion and came out onto the bow deck in the dark. The deck was wet from the day's fog. He moved aft along the port rail, low, using the cabin superstructure as cover, and he could hear voices below him now, the door to the passage, someone coming through. The first man, he thought, the one who'd been nearest the door in the saloon and who had moved fastest. The third man would still be with Damien, which meant the second man in the passage was either out or working back to his feet and was not an immediate problem. He reached the midship section and looked aft. The main deck saloon had sliding glass panels on the port side. Through them he could see the interior, Damien on his feet now, back toward the aft end of the saloon, the third man in front of him with his weapon covering the saloon doorway. They were expecting him to come back through the passage. They were not looking up. He went over the rail onto the side deck and moved aft along the exterior until he reached the sliding panel. It was not locked. Expensive yachts in private anchorages at midnight are not locked from the outside because nobody is supposed to be on the outside at midnight. He slid it open 8 inches, enough, and came through it in a motion that was faster than it should have been for a man who had already taken one wall at full speed and who could feel the blooming ache along his left shoulder where the impact had landed wrong. The third man heard him on the last step. He was turning when Vincent reached him, and the turn was not fast enough, and they went into the saloon table together. The table Damien had set with 2 glasses and his practiced reasonableness. And the weapon discharged into the ceiling, and then Vincent had the man's arm at an angle that the arm was not designed to sustain, and the sound the arm made was followed immediately by the weapon hitting the floor and the man's focus collapsing entirely to his own pain. Vincent put him down and straightened up and looked at Damien. Damien had not moved. He stood at the aft end of the saloon with his hands at his sides and looked at Vincent across the wreckage of the conversation and the table and 2 of the 3 men he'd brought to manage the situation, and his expression was the expression of a man updating a calculation he'd believed was final. "The first man," Vincent said. His breathing was elevated. He let it be elevated because managing the appearance of it cost energy he needed elsewhere. "Where does he come out?" Damien said nothing. "Damien." "Starboard aft," Damien said. "The passage exits at the cockpit." The cockpit was directly behind Damien. Vincent crossed the saloon in 4 steps and took Damien by the arm, not roughly, but with the absolute authority of someone who has decided the negotiation phase is finished, and moved him toward the port side forward, away from the cockpit, and they went through the passage door and forward into the cabin he'd come through, and Vincent pulled the arm to stop them both and listened. Footsteps on the deck above. The first man had heard the shot and had gone topside and was moving aft toward the cockpit, which meant he was about to come down into the cockpit and find one of his colleagues on the saloon floor and the other out of commission in the port passage. And Vincent had perhaps 15 seconds before that man's threat assessment reconfigured. "The Petrov representatives," Vincent said. His voice was very quiet. Damien was close enough that quiet was sufficient. "You said they arrive tomorrow morning, by water or by road?" Damien looked at him. Something had changed in his face. Not capitulation, not yet, but the first faint evidence of a man revising his confidence in the structure he'd built. "Road," he said. "Point of contact." "Vincent, I will ask you once more, and then I will find another way to get the answer, and you will not be part of the conversation I have with them." He held Damien's eyes. "Where?" A pause that lasted 3 full seconds. Above them, the footsteps had stopped. The first man was in the cockpit now, finding the scene, making decisions. They had less time than 15 seconds. "The harbor master's building at Crescent Dock," Damien said. 7 a.m. "How many?" 2 principals, 4 security." "Who knows the location besides you?" "Bruno, and the Petrov side." Vincent absorbed that. Bruno. Who had come to Damien of his own accord, who had tallied costs and made his choice. Bruno, who had been in the family 30 years and who would be at Crescent Dock at 7 in the morning, representing the other side of a transition document that Vincent had no intention of signing. He heard the cockpit door. The first man was coming back inside. "Move," Vincent said, and pushed Damien forward through the cabin toward the forward hatch, and went up through it himself and pulled Damien up after him with a force that did not invite discussion, and they came out onto the bow deck in the cold dark just as the sound of the cockpit entry reached them from below. Vincent looked at the water. 60 feet to the anchorage dock. Cold. Dark. 200 yards from there to his car. He looked at Damien. "You can swim," he said. It was not a question. Damien looked at the water. Looked at Vincent. Something moved through his face. "You're going to Crescent Dock," he said. "Yes." "Bruno will have—" "I know what Bruno will have." He took Damien's arm again and moved him to the rail. "You're coming with me. When we get to the dock, you're going to walk to my car and get in, and you're going to stay in it. And if you make any decision that is not that decision, I will find out about it before you've completed it. Are we clear?" Damien looked at him for one long moment in the dark above the water, and Vincent saw in that look the whole 11 years of it, the calculation, the architecture, the long patience of a man who had decided decades ago that the way to survive in a world like this was to always be the one with more information and more pieces in play than anyone else in the room. He saw it, and he saw also the moment that architecture registered its own failure. Not completely, not with anything like resignation, but the first honest acknowledgement of a man who has run a very long game and has arrived at a position he did not design. "Clear," Damien said. They went over the rail together. Oops. The water was cold enough to compress his chest for the first 2 seconds, and then his body found its regulation, and he swam with the economical stroke of someone whose focus was on the destination rather than the experience of getting there. Damien swam beside him. The man was 61, and he swam without complaint, which said something about him that Vincent filed and did not examine. They reached the dock in under 3 minutes. Vincent came up the dock ladder first and turned and gave Damien a hand that Damien took without hesitation, and they stood dripping on the dock boards in the midnight cold, and Vincent was already moving toward the access path before the water had stopped running off him. He called Gio from the path. "I need you at Crescent Dock at 6:45, he said. "Reyes and Park. Nobody else. Come clean. No family vehicles. Nothing that connects to the organization." Gio's voice came back instantly. No questions about the water he could probably hear in Vincent's voice. "Done. What are we walking into?" "A meeting that's been scheduled without us." He paused. "Bruno will be there." A silence on Gio's end that said everything it needed to say. "Understood. One more thing. Get word to Messina and Carver tonight. Not from me, from a neutral source they'll believe. Tell them Damien's structure is compromised. Tell them the Petrov network has been operating in the coastal channels for 8 months without the family's knowledge or consent. Give them enough to make the recalculation on their own." He looked at Damien walking ahead of him up the path. "They'll move back to center when they understand which side is actually going to be standing tomorrow. And if they don't, then they've made a choice they own." He reached the car. 6:45, Gio." He ended the call and opened the passenger door and looked at Damien, who got in without being told. Vincent went around to the driver's side and got in and started the engine and turned the heat to maximum and sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel while the warmth began to cut into the cold that had settled through him from the water. Damien sat in the passenger seat and dripped on the upholstery and looked forward through the windshield. "You're not going to contain this with 3 men at a dock," Damien said. "The Petrov network is not 2 principals and 4 security. That's the visible face of it. The infrastructure behind it—" "I know what's behind it," Vincent said. "I built the file on them for 3 years before the takedown. What I didn't know was what survived the takedown because you curated that information too." He put the car in gear. "Tell me what survived." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then, with the air of a man making a decision he's known was eventually unavoidable. "The distribution network in the northern channels is intact. The financial infrastructure, roughly 60% of it. The operational commanders you believed were neutralized were relocated, not removed. 6 men. I have 3 of the 6 locations. Give them to me." "In exchange for what?" Vincent glanced at him. in exchange for the version of tomorrow where you're alive to see it. Damien looked at him for a long moment and then looked back at the road. The other 3 locations I genuinely don't have. That's not leverage. It's the limit of what they showed me. They're careful people. They were careful people, Vincent said. Give me the 3 you have. Damien gave them to him. Vincent committed them to memory with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his career operating in environments where writing things down was a liability. They drove north along the coast road in silence for several miles. The heating was working now, and the worst of the cold had passed, and Vincent's shoulder was informing him in a consistent and detailed way that the impact in the passage was going to be a problem by morning. He noted it and set it aside. "Why did you stay?" Vincent said. "You could have run. 3 days ago when I surfaced, you could have activated the financial structure and gone. It was ready. You said so." Damien was quiet for a moment. "Because running means I spend the rest of my life being the man who ran from Vincent Moretti, and that is not a comfortable identity in the circles I intend to inhabit." He paused. "And because I thought I could still close it cleanly. The yacht, the conversation, the document. If you'd signed, it would have been clean. Everyone moves forward. No one has to account for the years behind them." "And the children," Vincent said. "What was the plan for the children in the clean version?" Damien said nothing. "Damien, they were not part of the plan," he said. "They were never going to be touched. I want you to understand that regardless of everything else." Vincent drove and did not respond, because what Damien wanted him to understand and what Vincent believed were not the same thing, and saying so at 70 miles an hour on a coastal road at midnight would not make tomorrow more manageable. He dropped Damien at the inland farmhouse at 1:15 in the morning. He had not intended to bring him here. He had intended to leave Damien in a position that was controlled and secure and entirely separate from Elena and the children, but the alternative positions he'd run through on the drive north had each carried risks that the farmhouse, with its controlled access and its half-mile private drive, did not. Damien in a motel was Damien with options. Damien at the farmhouse was Damien inside a perimeter that Vincent understood. Elena opened the door before he'd knocked. She took in his wet clothing, his expression, and Damien Voss standing 2 steps behind him, and the sequence of responses that moved through her face in the space of 3 seconds was the most compressed emotional data Vincent had ever watched a person process without sound. She looked at Damien for a long moment, and Damien looked at her, and the air between the 3 of them in the farmhouse doorway had a density that was almost architectural. Then Elena stepped back and let them in. She did not speak to Damien. She went to the kitchen and came back with towels. The practical, unreflective action of a woman who had been dealing with crises on her own for 4 years and had long since passed the point where the emotional content of a situation prevented the functional response. She put one towel on the entry table and took the other and handed it to Vincent and looked at his face with the clinical attention of someone assessing damage. "Your shoulder," she said. "In the morning. Now, sit down." He sat at the kitchen table and let her work because there was no efficient argument against it. And while she pressed along the shoulder joint with her hands and determined with the focused practicality of someone who had taken 2 first aid certifications during her years alone that nothing was fractured, he watched Damien standing in the kitchen doorway with his own towel over his shoulders and his expression arranged into something that was either contrition or its very good approximation. "You should know," Damien said to Elena, "that Vincent never ordered anything against you. I want to say that to you directly." Elena did not look up from Vincent's shoulder. "I know," she said. "I've known for 3 days." "I want to say it anyway." She did look up then. She looked at Damien with a steadiness that could have cut glass. "You have said it," she said. "Now I'd like you to sit in the other room and be quiet while I figure out if my children's father has anything broken." Damien sat in the other room. Vincent almost said something. He decided against it. He slept 3 hours on the farmhouse sofa, which was not comfort, but was sufficient, and woke at 5:15 with the shoulders stiff and his mind already running the crescent dock geometry before his eyes had fully adjusted to the dim light. He lay still for a moment and listened to the farmhouse. Elena's breathing from the bedroom she'd taken with the children. The door cracked, the way she always left it when children were on the other side. A sound from the kitchen that was Damien, who apparently did not sleep, moving quietly around a space that wasn't his. Vincent got up. Damien had made coffee. He had made it without asking and had set out 2 cups with the unconscious service of a man who has spent decades in rooms where being useful was the clearest demonstration of his value. And Vincent looked at the cups and the coffee and the man standing at the farmhouse kitchen window looking out at the dark tree line and felt the full weight of 11 years compress into the space of a breath. He poured the coffee and drank it standing. "Bruno will arrive first," Damien said without turning from the window. "He's punctual, always has been. He'll have 2 men, not more, because he thinks the Petrov side is bringing the numbers and he doesn't want to look like he's positioning. What does he think is happening today? He thinks the transition document is being signed and his role in facilitating it is being acknowledged." A pause. "He expects to be named to an advisory position in the new structure. He's been promised something." "Everyone in this kind of arrangement is promised something," Damien said. He turned from the window. In the kitchen light at 5 in the morning, he looked his age in a way he hadn't on the yacht, the years showing through the controlled surface in the specific way they show through when a man has been awake all night with a collapsed plan. "The Petrov principles will have documentation. The transition agreement, already prepared. They'll want it executed on-site and out of the building within the hour." "How legally constructed is it?" "Enough to cause problems, not enough to survive a full exposure of the circumstances." He met Vincent's eyes. "If you go to Crescent Dock with the Felix file and 3 captains and the story of how this arrangement was built, and you put it in front of the right people before 7 a.m., the Petrov principles arrive to a situation rather than a signing." "I know," Vincent said. "The family captains who are still yours, Reyes, Park, they need to be the ones who receive the file. Not from you, from a source the wider organization will accept." He paused. "That source needs to be me." Vincent looked at him. "I built the architecture," Damien said. "I know every piece of it. I know what I told each captain, what leverage I used, what promises I made, and what the promises were worth. I can dismantle it faster than anyone else because I built it." He looked at Vincent steadily. "Let me call Messina and Carver myself. Tonight, I mean, now before 6. Let me be the one who tells them what they were actually part of and what the Petrov network was planning to do with the organization after the transition. Messina has a son who runs the Eastern Port operation. Carver has a daughter in the financial structure. When they understand what the Petrov network does with the people who facilitated them, once the facilitation is no longer needed," he stopped, "they'll move." Vincent stood in the farmhouse kitchen and looked at Damien Voss and thought about all the ways this could be the last layer of the architecture, the final piece of a structure that had one more room he hadn't seen. He thought about it with the full weight of 11 years of misdirected trust and the cold, systematic intelligence that had built an empire on exactly this kind of analysis. Then he thought about Felix's file, about the fabricator in Baltimore, about the relocation facilitator's records, and the birth certificates with the blank father fields, and the 4 years of a life he hadn't been allowed to know existed. "Make the calls," he said. Damien took the phone he'd been given and went to the far end of the kitchen and began to dial. And Vincent topped up his coffee and walked to the window and looked out at the dark tree line in the last hour before the sky began to shift. And behind him he could hear Damien's voice, low and even, saying the words that began the dismantling of the thing he'd spent 11 years constructing. And there was no satisfaction in it, and there was no relief. Only the grinding forward motion of a situation that was not finished and would not be finished until 6 men Vincent had never met arrived at a dock at the edge of this gray coast and found something very different from what they'd been promised. At 5:50, Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at Damien on the phone. She looked at Vincent at the window. She poured herself a coffee and came to stand beside him, and they both looked at the tree line together without speaking. Then she said very quietly, "Come back. That's still the condition." "I know," he said. "I'm not saying it twice." "You won't have to." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded once. Not softly, not gently, but with the compressed conviction of a woman who has made a decision she knows is the right one and is not going to revisit it, and went back down the hall to where the children were sleeping. Vincent set down his coffee. Damien ended his last call and turned around. "Messina and Carver are moving back. Bruno." He paused. Bruno has committed. He won't turn, not even now. He's been in this too long to walk it back in one phone call. I know, Vincent said. He'll be armed, and his 2 men will be armed, and he will not come quietly. I know that too. Vincent picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. Let's go. Outside the farmhouse, the sky was beginning to separate from the tree line in the east. Not light yet, but the first suggestion of it, the dark thinning at the edges in the way it does in the last 40 minutes before dawn. And Vincent walked to the car through the cold air with Damien 2 steps behind him and the weight of everything that was about to happen pressing forward into the morning with the same patient inevitability as the light. His phone buzzed. Gio, already at position. He got in the car and started the engine and looked at the farmhouse for one moment. The lit kitchen window, the dark upstairs windows where his children were asleep, the blue-gray of the pre-dawn pressing against the glass. Then he drove toward Crescent Dock with everything he had and nothing he was willing to lose. Crescent Dock sat at the southern edge of the harbor where the working waterfront gave way to the administrative margin, the harbormaster's building, a fuel depot, 2 commercial storage units that had been empty for years and that nobody had gotten around to demolishing. At 6:40, the sky was the color of dirty iron, and the dock lights were still on, burning yellow against the pre-dawn gray, and the water in the harbor basin moved with the slow indifference of deep cold. Gio was already there. So were Reyes and Park. Vincent pulled in behind the fuel depot and cut the engine and sat for a moment looking at the harbormaster's building through the windshield. Single story, cinder block, 2 windows facing the dockside and 1 facing the access road, 1 door on each face. The kind of building that was designed for function and had achieved it without any concession to anything else. Damien sat in the passenger seat and said nothing. Stay in the car, Vincent said. Vincent, if I need you, I'll call you in. If you hear shooting and you don't hear from me in 10 minutes, you drive to the farmhouse and you get Elena and the children out of there and you go somewhere the Petrov network has never heard of and you stay there until Gio contacts you. He looked at Damien directly. That's your function today. That's the only function you have. Damien looked at him for a moment, then he nodded. Vincent got out of the car. Gio materialized from the shadow beside the fuel depot. A compact man in his 40s who moved with the particular economy of someone who had spent his entire adult life in situations where drawing attention was a professional failure. Behind him, Reyes and Park stood close to the depot wall, both of them reading the environment the way trained men read environments, continuous and automatic. Bruno's inside, Gio said quietly. 2 men with him, like Damien said. They arrived at 6:20. He paused. The Petrov principals are not here yet. Vincent checked his watch. 6:42, 18 minutes. How's the building laid out inside, he said. Single room, main area, storage alcove in the back right. The harbor master is not present. Bruno's people sent him home at 6. No witnesses inside. Bruno know we're here? Not yet. Vincent looked at the building. 18 minutes before 6, men arrived to a situation they had constructed over months with the careful confidence of people who had done this before. 18 minutes to change what they were arriving to. He looked at Reyes. You've seen the file. Gio sent it at 5:30, Reyes said. He was a big man, quiet in the way large men sometimes are, with the kind of face that communicated reliability rather than intelligence, though he had both. All of it. And Bruno made his bed. He said it without heat, simply the way facts are stated by people who deal in them. We're here. Vincent turned back to the building. I go in first, he said. Alone. Give me 3 minutes. If it goes wrong, you'll hear it. Gio started to object. Vincent was already walking on. He opened the harbor master's door without knocking. Bruno Accardi was 63 years old and had been in the family since Vincent was a teenager, watching from the edges of rooms he wasn't yet authorized to enter. He was a large man who had been larger once, the weight of age redistributing what had been physical authority into something that was more settled and more dangerous in a different way. The danger of a man who no longer needed to demonstrate anything, because what he was had been established so long ago that demonstrating it would be redundant. He was sitting at the harbor master's desk with a coffee that he'd apparently brought himself, and his two men were positioned near the back wall with the patient alertness of professionals on standby. He looked up when Vincent came in, and his expression did not change. That was the first thing. The expression did not change, which meant he was not surprised, which meant he had known Vincent was outside, which meant his positioning was already established before the door opened. Vincent stopped 3 steps inside and let the door close behind him and looked at the room. "Vince," Bruno said. He had a voice like old wood, dense and dry and slow to ignite. He used Vincent's shortened name the way he always had, with the familial ease of 30 years, and the ease of it in this room was obscene. "Sit down." "I'll stand," Vincent said. Bruno looked at him for a moment. Then he lifted his coffee and drank from it and set it down with the deliberateness of a man establishing that he is not rushed. "You talked to Damien," he said. "Yes." "Then you know what's coming this morning." "I know what you think is coming," Vincent said. Bruno's eyes moved, not to his men, just a fractional shift that registered their positions without pointing at them. The unconscious inventory of a man who has operated in threatening environments for decades. "The Petrov network is not something you can dismantle twice," he said. "The first time you had the element of surprise, and you had Damien feeding you curated intelligence that gave you the angles. This time, you have neither." He looked at Vincent steadily. "I am not your enemy in this. I want you to understand that. What I did because the direction the organization was going to get people killed. Not enemies, our people. Families." "So you arranged to hand it to the Petrov network," Vincent said, "which is known to leave families intact." Bruno's jaw tightened, just slightly. "The arrangement has terms. The arrangement has terms that Damien accepted because the Petrov network told him what he needed to hear to get the document signed. What happens to the terms after the document is signed is a different conversation." He watched Bruno's face. "You know that, Bruno. You've been in this long enough to know that the terms that exist before a transfer and the terms that exist after one are not the same terms." A silence in the harbor master's building. The dock lights hummed faintly through the windows. "Step away from it," Vincent said. "Right now. Take your men and walk out and go home, and I'll handle what comes through that door at 7 as an internal organizational matter that you were not present for." Bruno looked at him for a long time. The coffee was getting cold in front of him, and he didn't touch it. His two men at the back wall had the stillness of men who were waiting for a signal they had not yet received. "You can't offer me what they offered me," Bruno said. "I'm not offering you anything. I'm telling you the door behind me is open, and you can walk through it, or you can be in this room at 7 o'clock and deal with the consequences of that." Another silence. Bruno set both hands flat on the desk, the gesture of a man planting himself. "I've been in this family since before you had a seat at any table," he said, and for the first time there was something in the old wood of his voice that was not quite heat, but was its precursor. "I watched your predecessor build it from 20 men and a distribution route that fit in one truck. I watched the years that it cost, and I watched you take what 30 years built and run it into the ground of your own ambitions. And when the bill came due, I found people who were willing to pay it in a way that kept the structure alive." His eyes were steady on Vincent's. "I don't need your door." Vincent had known before he came in that Bruno would not move. He had known it when Damien said Bruno had committed and meant it. He had come in anyway because the alternative was initiating something that 3 people in a room witnessed before it needed to be witnessed, and the next 14 minutes required a different geometry than 3 people. He looked at Bruno's 2 men. "Walk out," he said to them directly. Neither of them moved. "Your employer's situation is between him and me and has been building for longer than you've been in it," Vincent said. "That's not your weight to carry. The door is open." The younger of the 2 men, 25 maybe, with the particular blankness of someone hired recently and committed to nothing yet, looked at Bruno. Bruno said, "Stay." The young man stayed. Vincent had his weapon out before the sentence was finished, and the geometry of the room changed entirely. What happened in the next 4 minutes was not clean. It was not clean, and it was not quiet, and the shoulder that had taken the passage wall on Damien's yacht made itself known in a way that affected the mechanics of every motion he made. A burning that was not paralyzing, but was constant and specific enough to be a variable he had to account for in real time. He accounted for it. Bruno's older man moved first and was the greater immediate threat, and Vincent dealt with him first, And the dealing with him was the thing that cost the most. 2 exchanges in close quarters that left Vincent with a split across his left eyebrow that bled immediately and freely, the way head wounds do, and left the older man on the floor of the harbor master's building with injuries that were serious but not terminal, because the floor of a harbor master's building in a coastal town was not where Vincent needed another death. The younger man made a better decision than Bruno had given him the option to make, and put his weapon on the floor and stepped back against the wall with both hands up, and the expression of someone very grateful they had chosen the right moment to reassess their loyalties. Bruno had stood up from the desk. He was not armed, not with a firearm. He never had been. It had been one of his principles, stated once in a room Vincent remembered clearly, that a man who reached his position by carrying a weapon had not done it right. He stood behind the desk and looked at Vincent across the body of his older man, and the blood coming down Vincent's face, and the young man against the wall, and the calculation that moved behind Bruno's eyes was the calculation of a man who has arrived at the end of a very long road and is taking the measure of what it looks like. "It didn't have to be this," Bruno said. "No," Vincent said, "it didn't." "You ran it wrong, Vince. That's not bitterness. That's 30 years of watching how these things go." His voice was quieter now, the heat that had been its precursor having arrived and already passed, leaving the old wood quality again, but stripped of something, the way wood sounds when the grain has been exposed. "You built for conquest. You should have built for survival." Vincent looked at him across the room. The blood from his eyebrow had reached his jaw. "I know," he said. Bruno looked at him sharply. "I know," Vincent said again. "That's not an argument I'm going to have with you. You're right about what I built and what it cost and the direction it was heading. You were right about all of it." He held Bruno's eyes. "You just chose the wrong solution." A long silence. "What happens now?" Bruno said. "Now you sit down and you don't move, and in 11 minutes, 6 people walk through that door and find a situation that is not what they planned for." Bruno looked at him for another moment. Then he sat down. He did it slowly, with the weight of a man whose body has been carrying him for 63 years and has strong opinions about it, and he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and looked at the cold coffee and said nothing more. Vincent went to the door and opened it and lifted 2 fingers, and Gio, Reyes, and Park came in from the dark. The Petrov principals arrived at 7:04. They came in a black vehicle that was expensive without being conspicuous. The choice of people who had learned that conspicuous money attracted the wrong kind of attention and had adjusted accordingly. 4 security men first, then 2 principals who were not what Vincent had expected, which was to say they were not what the Petrov network's reputation had led him to construct in his imagination over 3 years of building a case against them. They were not theatrical. They were not imposing. They were 2 men in their 50s who dressed like accountants and moved like people who had spent a long time being underestimated and had found it professionally useful. They walked into the harbor master's building and found Vincent Moretti standing at the harbor master's desk with 3 men behind him, and Bruno Accardi sitting in a chair against the wall with his hands in his lap, and the Felix file open on the desk in front of the space where the transition document was supposed to be waiting. The older of the 2 principals, a man named, according to Felix's file, Gregor Vasek, stopped inside the door and looked at the room with the eyes of someone whose threat assessment was exceptional and who was doing it very fast. He looked at Vincent. "You're not Damien Voss," he said. "No," Vincent said. Vasek's eyes moved to Bruno. Bruno did not look up. "Where is Voss?" Vasek said. "Not here." Vincent gestured to the file on the desk. "That's everything your network has been operating in the northern channels for the past 8 months. Routes, personnel, financial infrastructure, the names of 6 commanders your organization relocated rather than removed after the Providence operation." He paused. "It's also the complete documentation of the arrangement Damien made with you, including the terms you offered him and the separate terms your network operates under after a transition of this type, which Damien was not shown." Vasek looked at the file. His expression was not alarmed. It was the expression of a man recalculating. "And you're offering us what?" he said. "An arrangement of your own." "I'm offering you the chance to leave this building," Vincent said. "Take your people. Leave the Northern Channel operations, all 6 locations, all personnel, all infrastructure. Full withdrawal. You have 72 hours before I activate everything in that file with every relevant authority and every competing network that has reason to know your people are operating on this coast. The second principal, younger, who had not spoken, said something in a language that was not English to Vasek. Vasek listened without looking at him. You understand what you're asking us to walk away from, Vasek said. I understand exactly what I'm asking. And if we decline, Vincent looked at him steadily, then this morning goes a different way, and neither of us is going to enjoy it. The four security men had distributed themselves in the room in the way that security men do, and Gio and Reyes and Park had adjusted their positions in response. And the configuration of the room was a held breath, the geometry of a moment that was one decision away from becoming irreversible. Vasek looked at Vincent for a long time. He was reading him. The blood on his face, the set of his shoulders, the quality of stillness in a man who has already spent the night in violence and is not destabilized by the prospect of more. He was reading what kind of man he was dealing with, which was what professional people do before they make professional decisions. Then Vasek said something to his men in the language that was not English. They moved toward the door. Vasek looked at Vincent one last time. 72 hours is not enough time, he said. It's what I'm giving you. Vasek looked at the file on the desk, at Bruno against the wall, at the harbor building with its humming dock lights and its cold coffee and everything it contained this morning that it was not supposed to contain. Then he turned and walked out. The door closed. The room held its breath for another 3 seconds, and then Gio exhaled and Reyes moved his hand away from his weapon, and Park went to the window and watched the black vehicle until it was gone. Bruno was still looking at his hands. Bruno, Vincent said. The old man looked up. Go home, Vincent said. Bruno looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in the old face, not relief, not quite, but its distant relative. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight he chose and has set it down and is surprised to discover the ground is still there. He stood up slowly and walked to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. The children, he said, without turning around. Are fine, Vincent said. A pause. Good, Bruno said, and walked out. Vincent sat in the harbor master's chair for 10 minutes after everyone else had gone. Gio had left men on the building and taken the injured man to a private medical contact, and taken Bruno's younger man somewhere quiet for a conversation that would determine whether he was a variable that needed continued management. And Reyes and Park had gone to begin the work of the file, the activation of the Northern Channel documentation through the organizational channels that would cement the withdrawal, the communication to Messina and Carver, that the situation had resolved in a direction they should position themselves accordingly to, and the first of the captain meetings that would establish the new organizational footing before the end of the day. Vincent sat in the chair with the file closed in front of him and the blood from his eyebrow drying on his jaw and the shoulder burning with the patient consistency of an injury that was going to require actual attention, and the harbor light coming through the windows in the way that light comes through windows on a gray coast in the early morning. Thin, without warmth, honest in the way that light is honest when it's not trying to be anything other than light. He thought about 11 years. He thought about what Bruno had said, built for conquest, should have built for survival, and sat with the accuracy of it the way you sit with things that are accurate and uncomfortable and that you cannot argue against because they are simply true. He had run the organization the way he had run everything in his life, which was all the way and without reservation and toward victory as an end rather than stability as a condition, and the cost of that had been extracted not from his enemies, who had expected it, but from the people proximate to him, who had not. Elena had not expected it. His children had not had the opportunity to expect anything. He stood up, picked up the file, walked out into the gray morning and got in the car and drove north. The farmhouse in the daylight looked different from the farmhouse at night, smaller, more ordinary, the second-growth woodland around it visible now in its actual character, which was scrubby and impermanent, young trees that hadn't decided yet what they were going to be. He parked in the drive and sat for a moment looking at the kitchen window. Elena was there. He could see her moving in the kitchen. He got out and walked to the door and knocked. He knocked, which he had not done at the Cliff House or at Morse Street, and waited. She opened the door and looked at his face. The blood had dried brown on his jaw and the eyebrow had closed, but the area around it was swelling, and she stood in the doorway and looked at all of it with an expression that was absolutely controlled except for the single thing that moved through her eyes in the first second, the thing she could not control because nobody can control the first second. "It's done," he said. She stepped back and let him in. He sat at the kitchen table and she cleaned the eyebrow with the same focused practicality she'd brought to the shoulder the night before, and neither of them spoke while she worked. And it was not a painful silence. It was the silence of two people who have been through something together that is still too large and too close to narrate. The children were somewhere upstairs. He could hear Lucas's voice and the sound of Mia responding, the ordinary conversation of two children who had been told the adventure was almost over and were processing this with the resourcefulness of the very young. When Elena was done, she put the kid away and stood at the counter with her back to him for a moment. Then she turned. "Damien," she said. "In the back room," Vincent said. "I need to deal with him today." "Deal with him how?" He looked at her. "He's going to do what he said he'd do, dismantle what's left of the internal architecture. Walk back the conversions. There are 3 captain meetings and about 60 hours of organizational work that he's better positioned to execute than anyone else because he built the thing he's dismantling." He paused. "After that, I'm putting him in front of the family with the full accounting, every piece of the file. What he did to the organization and what he did to you." He held her eyes. "After that, he's out. No position, no role, no connection. He goes away clean because he cooperated, and because without his cooperation this morning would have gone differently. But he goes away." Elena looked at him steadily. "And that's enough." "It's what the situation allows," Vincent said. "I know it's not—" "It's enough," she said. Not forgiving him, not Damien, just closing the accounting on the thing she'd carried for 4 years, drawing a line under it with the pragmatism of a woman who had decided that carrying it further cost more than what she got from carrying it. He understood that. He honored it. "There's one more thing," he said. She waited. "I'm stepping back from the organization. Not today. The transition needs time to stabilize. There are captains who need to be held in place until the new structure is established, and I'm the only one who can hold them right now. 3 months, maybe 4. He looked at his hands on the table. "After that, Reyes takes the leadership and I'm done. I'm a consultant, an advisor, someone they call when the thing requires history and won't require me to make the kind of decisions I've spent 15 years making." He looked up at her. "That's the plan. That's what I'm offering. I'm not asking you to decide anything today. I'm telling you what I intend." Elena looked at him across the kitchen table of a farmhouse on the inland road of a coastal town nobody remembered, and the morning light came through the window and did what it did without any particular interest in what was happening beneath it, and she looked at him with the dark eyes he had known for 7 years, and the face that was exactly her face, carrying everything the last 4 years had added to it, and she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "You should eat something." She turned and opened the refrigerator and began to make something, and Vincent sat at the table and let her, and after a moment he heard the children on the stairs, Lucas first, the deliberate tread, and then Mia's lighter and faster behind him, and they came into the kitchen, and Lucas stopped when he saw Vincent's face. "What happened to your eye?" Lucas said. "I hit a door," Vincent said. Lucas looked at him with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old who is not yet old enough to pretend to believe things he doesn't believe. "That looks like more than a door," he said. It was a heavy door. Mia had come around the table and put her hand on Vincent's arm without preamble, the way she'd put her hand in his at the card table on Moore Street, with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a child for whom physical reassurance is given as easily as it's received. She looked at his eyebrow with enormous seriousness. "Does it hurt?" she said. "A little," he said. She nodded gravely. "Mama makes it better," she said. "She made my knee better when I fell on the rocks." She looked at Elena at the counter. "Right, Mama?" "Right," Elena said. Lucas pulled out the chair across from Vincent and sat in it and looked at him. It was the look he'd had at the card table, reading the room, working something out. "Are we going home today?" he said. Vincent looked at him. "Do you want to go home?" Lucas considered this with the serious pragmatism of a child for whom home is a concrete concept rather than an emotional one. "Mia left her bear at the house," he said. She didn't tell you because she didn't want to be difficult, but she always sleeps with it. Mia looked at her brother with an expression that was betrayal and gratitude in equal measure. We'll go get it, Vincent said. Lucas looked at him for a moment longer, then he said, Okay, with the tone of someone who has conducted an assessment and reached a conclusion, and turned to ask Elena what was for breakfast with the topic change efficiency of a child who is done with a thing when he's done with it. Vincent sat at the table and listened to his son and his daughter argue amiably about whether eggs were a good breakfast, and Elena settled the argument with the ease of someone who had been settling it for 4 years and had long since found the solution, and the morning moved the way mornings move in kitchens when people are in them, ordinarily, without drama, with the small particular sounds of coffee and conversation and chairs scraping and children who cannot sit still. Damien left the farmhouse at noon. Vincent walked him to the car that Gio had brought, and they stood in the drive in the pale midday light. And Damien put his bag in the back and turned around and looked at Vincent with the expression of a man who has said everything necessary and knows it, and is not going to fill the remaining space with things that are not necessary. The captain meetings, Vincent said. Reyes will coordinate the schedule. I want the Bruno conversation handled before Thursday. I understand. And the fabricator in Baltimore. I want a voluntary statement, not a subpoena. Make it comfortable for him. I'll handle it personally. They stood for a moment. The wind off the coast was working its way inland, carrying the salt of it, the particular smell of this stretch of geography that Vincent had spent 11 days trying to let into his nervous system as something other than a tactical environment, and that he was only now beginning to understand as what it actually was, which was the place where his children had grown up, and where the sound of the ocean had been the ordinary background of their ordinary lives. You should know, Damien said, that the organization, what Reyes will be inheriting, is genuinely sound. Beneath everything I built around it, and everything that was constructed in the last 18 months, the core is sound. The Petrov network was never inside the core. I kept it clean. He looked at Vincent steadily. I want you to know that. I know that, Vincent said, because it matters. For the children. He paused. For what you're walking toward. Vincent looked at him. Go do the work, Damien. Damien got in the car. Vincent watched it go down the half-mile private drive and turn onto the road and disappear, and stood in the farmhouse drive for another minute in the midday cold with the wind moving through him, and then went back inside. They returned to Moore Street that afternoon. Mia found her bear on the bedroom floor where she'd left it and clutched it with the intensity of a reunion that had been 4 days in the making, and Lucas walked through each room of the house with the systematic thoroughness of someone conducting an inspection, and Elena stood in the kitchen and looked at her kitchen and was very still for a moment in the way that people are still when they have come back to something they weren't certain they'd come back to. Vincent helped carry in what they'd taken from the farmhouse. He did not ask whether he was staying. He did not offer to leave. He moved through the house with the quiet purposefulness of a man who is learning the dimensions of a space he has not been in before, learning where things are kept, and how the light comes through the south window in the afternoon, and which door of the cabinet sticks and requires lifting before it opens properly. He learned these things without announcing that he was learning them, and Elena watched him learn them without commenting, and this exchange, wordless, practical, domestic in the most basic sense, was the truest conversation they'd had since he'd appeared on her door line. That night, after the children were in bed, they sat on the rear deck of the house on Moore Street, with the ocean below the cliff making its patient sound. And Elena had a glass of wine, and Vincent had bourbon, and neither of them looked at the other for a long time, just sat with the dark water and the sound and the cold salt air. I used to think about you, Elena said. Not an accusation, a fact offered the way she offered facts, plainly, without preamble or softening. When? He said. The first year. After I got here, before I stopped letting myself. She drank. I'd be up with Mia at 3 a.m. She didn't sleep. For months she didn't sleep. And I'd be sitting in that chair in the corner of her room and the whole town would be quiet, and I'd think about what you were doing at 3 a.m. wherever you were. Probably in a car somewhere, he said. Probably. She looked at the water. I thought you'd be fine. That was the other part of it. The part I didn't expect to feel the way I felt it. I thought he'll be fine. He has the organization and the empire and the battles and all of it, and he'll be fine. And I'll be here at 3 in the morning with a child who won't sleep, and I'll be fine too." She paused. We were both fine. That was the cruelest part of it. Vincent looked at his glass. "I wasn't fine," he said. She was quiet. "I was functional," he said. "I was operational. I did the work and I won the wars and I ran the thing that needed running and none of it—" He stopped. "Found it. None of it had any weight. That was what I noticed. Everything I did worked, and nothing had any weight." Elena looked at him then. Really looked at him, the way she had always been able to look at him, which was past the surface of the thing to the thing itself, and what she saw in his face apparently told her what she needed, because she looked away again at the ocean and did not speak, and the silence between them was not empty. "I'm not the same person you married," she said. "I know. And you're not that person either. I don't know if that's better or worse." "I don't know either," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide that tonight." She nodded once, slowly, drank the last of her wine, set the glass down on the deck rail with the same precision she brought to everything, and looked at the dark Atlantic moving below the cliff. "Lucas asked me tonight," she said, "when I was putting him down." "What did he ask?" "He asked if you were going to be here in the morning." She was quiet for a moment. "I told him I thought so. I told him to ask you himself." Vincent looked at the ocean. "I told him the truth," Elena said, "because I always tell him the truth. I told him I thought you were trying to stay." She paused. "I want you to know I said that." "Thank you," he said. She stood up and picked up her glass and looked at him one more time in the dark of the deck with the ocean behind her. "The guest room is made up," she said, "for tonight," and she went inside. Vincent stayed on the deck for another hour. He stayed until the cold had worked all the way through him, and the bourbon was finished, and the last of what he'd been carrying since the Cliff House 11 days ago, the anger and the calculation and the architecture of a war that was now over, had settled into something that was not peace, but was the beginning of the territory that peace eventually grows from, if you're patient enough and if you don't burn the ground before it has a chance. Below the cliff, the waves came in and pulled back and came in again. He thought about his son asking whether he'd be there in the morning. He went inside. He was there in the morning. 3 months later, the organization passed to Reyes in a captain's meeting that was attended by every functioning member of the family leadership, including Messina and Carver, and 3 men who had been brought in from the outer structure to fill the seats that Bruno and 2 others had vacated. The documentation of Damien's 11-year architecture was laid before the meeting in full, not to punish, because punishment was not the function of the meeting, but because the family needed to understand what had been built around them and inside them and what had allowed it, so that the understanding could be the thing that prevented it. Reyes was a good choice. Vincent had known it before he'd voiced it, and watching him take the room confirmed it. He had the quality of leadership that Vincent had always lacked, which was that the people in front of him did not fear him, they respected him. And the difference between those 2 things was the difference between an organization that survives and an organization that consumes itself. Vincent sat at the back of the room during the meeting, not at the table. Nobody commented on this. Gio looked at him once, briefly, with an expression that said several things, and Vincent returned a look that said he understood all of them. When the meeting ended, he shook Reyes's hand and walked out. He drove back up the coast road with the windows down and the spring air coming in, which was different from the winter air he'd arrived in. Warmer, carrying something green in it from the land waking up, the smell of the world deciding to continue. He drove past the cliff house where he'd stood 11 days into his retirement and watched a woman walk barefoot on the beach below. He drove past the harbor where the fish market was already loud at this hour. He drove to Moore Street. Mia was in the garden when he pulled in, crouched over something in the overgrown bed along the fence that the previous tenant had let go and that Elena had been slowly reclaiming over the weeks, her small hands in the dirt with the focused satisfaction of a child who has been told she can plant whatever she wants and has taken this seriously. She looked up when she heard the car. "I found a worm," she said. "What kind?" She considered this. "A worm kind," she said. He crouched beside her and looked at the worm. It was, as described, a worm. "It's a good one," he said. She looked at it with the critical eye of someone who has found many worms and has developed standards. "It's okay," she said. "I found better." She patted the dirt back over it. "Lucas is inside. He's reading." "What's he reading?" "Something about boats." "He said it's important." She stood up and brushed her hands on her jeans with the decisive motion of someone who has completed a task. "Papa," she said. He looked at her. She pointed at a patch of the garden bed where she'd already been working, a cleared section where small green shoots were coming up in an uneven row, imprecise and determined. "I planted those," she said. 3 weeks ago. They're growing." He looked at the shoots, then at her face. "They are," he said. She nodded with the satisfaction of someone reporting a fact they are entirely pleased with. Then she went back inside and he stayed crouched in the garden for a moment, looking at the row of small green things pushing up through the dark soil, crooked and imperfect and absolutely committed to growing, and the spring air moved through the garden, and the ocean was audible beyond the cliff in the middle distance, and somewhere inside the house his son was reading about boats, and his daughter had gone to tell him something important about worms. He put his hand in the dirt beside the shoots. Just his hand, flat, feeling the cold of it, and the particular texture of ground that had been worked and cared for and given something to sustain. Then he stood up and went inside.